Good evening, everybody. Excuse me, Bill. How are you, Mr. Real?
I'm doing great, RFM. I sometimes think I'll jump in and say good evening or say something first, but I don't want to mess up the routine. And I think maybe my opening my mouth just a little bit there sort of messed us up. So sorry about that.
I wasn't even paying any attention to you, actually. But thanks for trying to take the blame for my fault.
There you go.
I'm so excited about tonight's show. We've got a great show tonight. We have on the show, and we'll bring him out in just a couple of minutes, Lars Nielsen, who has written a controversial and very exciting new book called How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass. There it is right there. There's my copy of it, which I got in the mail on Friday after having ordered it, I think, from Amazon. And I have made my way through it all the way, 366 pages, 368 if you want to count it a different way. And this is a large book. There's a lot of writing on every page. This is very densely written. And I will say right now that this is a very, very well-written book. Lars Nielsen is quite the author. He has amassed a great deal of information and research over the 10 years he spent working on this. And he has managed to take all that information and then put it into the book in a way that is capable, for me at least, to understand what it is he's saying. And he says it in a wonderful way, very interesting. So I think he's definitely earned the right through his research to be able to come on the show and present what it is that his thesis is and why it is that he believes this is the way the Book of Mormon came to pass, or the way it ended up being written, and why it looks and reads the way it does, and why, to steal a phrase from Brian Hales, why it has where the words came from, right? Where the words came from in the Book of Mormon, although I think Lars' theory on that's going to be different than Brian Hales. But before that, we've got Maven here, and she wants to report. She's actually not local. Where are you? Are you in Washington, D.C. now, Maven?
I am live on the scene at Washington, D.C., here for another protest. This time, no civil disobedience required. The issue at stake today is a federal law known as EMTALA. It's the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. And basically what it is an act that requires hospitals to receive people in who need medical care, urgent life-saving medical care, regardless of race, gender, circumstance, ability to pay, etc. It's been in place for a long time, and the reason why it's up for debate even is because of states like Idaho. It's Idaho that brought it. They have really draconian abortion bans, are arguing that this law requiring life-saving life-saving care given in case of emergency infringes on their rights to not perform any abortions. So if a pregnant person is in need of stabilizing care, if it will affect the fetus in any way, they're being turned away. And this is happening now. Pregnant women have not been able to get into an ER and have given birth in the bathroom of the ER waiting lobby, or have gone home to finish miscarrying on their own without any help or medical supervision. And it's really kind of insane that we're here and that we have to argue that ER should be able to stabilize people whose lives are in danger, but that's where we are. So yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, update. I know a lot of you guys know that I'm here. Maybe you didn't know that's what was at stake, or that was why, but yeah, and it was pretty well represented by the pro-choice side. I know a lot of pro-lifers say that they support exceptions in the case of the life of the mother, but there were not any of those pro-lifers there today. There was a very, very small collection. I don't think there were more than 5 souls beyond the organizers, like for their side of the event, and they're there arguing for states' rights, that they have the right to turn away pregnant people in dire distress and need. So it was pretty astounding. But anyway, that's what's going on. I hope you guys can at least find out what's going on in your state and try to stand up for people who need the help. And I appreciate everybody's support so much. Thank you.
Thanks for your report, Maven. And I think that regardless of where one lands on the political spectrum, I know that at least I appreciate people who have the courage of their convictions and actually make that trip out to Washington, D.C. I mean, from the West Coast to the East Coast, just to be present in order to protest something that shows that you really care about it. And I think that's laudable. All right. So let's bring on Lars Nielsen and let's talk about this incredible work of erudition that he just published. And I hope I didn't embarrass you too much by all the praise I was heaping upon your book, Lars. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing so well. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, RFM. I can't tell you how excited I am to be on your show today. I have wanted to call in several times over the years because I've had all of these tidbits of things that I've been working on. But given my schedule, I almost always end up listening to you guys the morning after the show airs. And so at long last, I'm finally able to make a few comments. Full
You're going to be
disclosure.
making more than a few. And by the way, I just remembered that I forgot to say something else before I unleashed you upon our audience, which is this, that Lars has, there's a lot of information that relates to this theory. If he were to present this entire book, it would take 24 hours minimum.
Yeah.
So he's been working hard on his slides. What we've decided is this, because that he's worked so hard and there's so much information, I want to give him the best chance to present his theory to the audience. We have agreed to give him no more than 90 minutes, though, to present that. He's been working on slides. I'm sure it'll be very interesting. I'm going to try and allow him to do that with a minimum of interruptions from myself. And I've talked with Bill. We just want to be able to give you the chance to present it and not, distract you with questions that might be relevant, but maybe could wait until the end.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, then, the goal then is to have no more than 1 hour of audience participation to ask questions that Lars can answer live here on the show. All right. So having said that, I yield my time to you, Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you for turning the time over to me. I really appreciate it. I am a little nervous as I have never been on the air before. So this is me taking a leap of faith. You might hear I've got a little something in my voice, so I will cough from time to time. And so just bear with me in that regard. So just to quickly introduce myself to the audience, I am a 45-year-old cisgendered white male of mostly Norwegian descent, genetically speaking. However, in my case, the name is Danish, Nielsen. Lots of people are getting that wrong on Reddit right now. With a name like Lars Nielsen, when I moved here to Minnesota, most of my neighbors assumed that I was a native Minnesotan. But in fact, I was born in sunny Phoenix, Arizona, living in Mesa until I was about 5 years old. And then my parents moved us to Modesto, California, which is where I went to high school. For those of you who are not watching this on YouTube, I've got some pictures up on the slide here. This is my very Mormon family off to the left. We are 10 children in total. My mom had 9 kids in 9 years. And because there are 2 sets of twins close together, there came a point where she actually had 6 kids that were 4 and under. In this next family photo, Lars is on the left, David's on the right. It was almost always that way, which might tell you something. We are twins, but even so, on our family t-shirts, I was number 2 and David was number 3. In high school, we played water polo. We were on the swim team, but what we enjoyed most was competing together in Science Olympiad and Science Bowl. One of my favorite things in life is to water ski, so I provided a picture of that down here. And Dave and I were both attended BYU and were even lab partners in our chemistry classes for several years, which was a lot of fun. In the middle of my sophomore year, I went on a Mormon mission to Sonora, Mexico, while David went to Sao Paulo, Brazil. When I got back, I finished my bachelor's degree in chemistry. He switched to business. After that, I went to Boston to get my master's and then a PhD in organic chemistry, concentrating specifically on, and this is a mouthful, mechanistic asymmetric catalysis. Just before the program was done, I got married and then decided to get an MBA. Graduated from that in 2009 at the worst of the financial crisis, but I was just happy to have a job, even if it meant moving to wintry Minnesota, which turned out to be the best thing ever. It's a wonderful place to raise kids. My 3 teenage daughters absolutely love it here, and so do I, despite the long winters. It was during those long winters that I finally gave myself the time and the permission to go deep on Mormon history, and more importantly, on the epistemology of my own beliefs. It took some time, but I eventually allowed myself to, be the same person in Sunday school that I had been in the laboratory. No more compartmentalization, and it felt great. And until it didn't. And very predictably, as this audience knows, I slowly reasoned my way out of the Mormon Church, making, however, the grave error of not having a robust support system outside of the Mormon community before sharing my concerns with others. The year of marital counseling that ensued was not very productive, each of us feeling betrayed and frankly abandoned by one another. For me, resignation from the church was a way to take my power back from a very high demand religion, which sealed, one might say, our decision to unseal the marriage. Well, at least in the eyes of the law, maybe not so much in the eyes of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I'm not saying that our decision is the best in all situations, but in our circumstance, divorce turned out to be the right decision. And that is how I became a full-time dad half of the time. All right. So 5 years after the divorce, my twin brother, Dave, who is then an employee of the now infamous Enzyme Peak Advisors, asked me to compose and submit a package on his behalf to the IRS Whistleblower Protection Program, some of which I ended up leaking to the press. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about this story, so I won't dwell on it here, except to say that Dave is the true hero in all of this. He is formally the whistleblower. Like I said in the Washington Post article, past reformers were like flashlights, but David gets to be a sun. I, on the other hand, am only a sunbeam, so to speak. I can't say that Jesus wanted me to be this particular sunbeam, but I'm glad that I was anyways, because in my experience, it's the cloud of secrecy that causes the most distrust and pain. And sometimes sunlight is the best disinfectant, even if only one beam at a time. That said, I'm not a co-whistleblower. Don't do that. My name is not affixed to the Form 211, and I have no special protection from retaliation by the corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Incidentally, it's very important to use the full name. The full name, mind you, each and every time.
Well, at least they know how to contact you at lars@howthebookofmormoncametopass.com. Is that right? Is that how anybody could contact you?
Anybody in the world can contact me. I've got hundreds of emails, maybe I will still say 100. It's not up to 1,000 yet over the last week and a half. It's been kind of an intense whirlwind journey. But yes, anyone in the world can get me at lars@howthebookofmormoncametopass.com. Some have asked me whether the COP has retaliated against me in any way. They have not, because of course they can't. Everything I disclosed was true, accurate, done in good faith. I think that the fruits of those disclosures are good. They resulted in the James Huntsman case, in the SEC fine on both the COP and EPA, and in the 5 class action lawsuits that just this week, as many of us know, are now largely consolidated in Utah, which is going to be interesting. But some have said that the fruits of my labors are sweet. Others say that they are bitter. Well, to each his own. But I will say, what's wrong with a little bit of both?
One man's treasure is another man's trash.
Exactly. Dave and I became estranged. It's no secret because of all this, and it is still that way. I take responsibility for the lion's share of that. The original sin, however, which I am not responsible for, is on the heads of the leadership of the Mormon Church. They're the ones who hoarded $100 billion when they shouldn't have. Finally, I just want to say that to me, Mormondom, post-Mormondom, is not a place nor an institution. It's a people. And by and large, from where I'm sitting, the people are good, minus the bad apples, of course. But I don't hate them. I wasn't motivated to do any of this with animus. Like, I do hate the fallacies in bad thinking, which in some circles is getting worse. I do hate the policies and practices that damage people, especially the LGBTQ community and those affected by sexual abuse. I do hate the high demand doctrines that take someone's worth away from them and then sells it back to them at 10% of their gross income annually. But most of all, I hate the repeated willful decisions to hide information again and again and again. So I try to speak my truth to power in my own way, which is largely to be a silent listener of podcasts like this one, while doing my own research and then writing a book. And obviously that's why we're here today.
And now you're on this podcast.
I
We
finally
get to hear
made
about
it.
your book.
I
You
got
made the
here.
big time.
Yeah. So if just to start, we always kind of have to start these sacrament-like talks with something a little bit cheesy. So I'll just say, when former Bishop Bill and his first counselor, RFM, called me up and asked me to give a talk on their podcast today, the subject that they assigned to me was how I got my testimony about how the Book of Mormon came to pass. Now, Webster's Dictionary, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go there. But it's true that as I was preparing this presentation, I really did feel like the same way that I did as I was preparing to give my first sacrament talk when I was like 12. So bear with me. A lot of the things here that I'm going to share are fundamentally new for most of us. And I really think exciting because it gives us a fresh way to think about old ideas, but with a lot of new data as well, and layered with new analysis. So that is why the title that I opted to give this presentation is New Data, New Analysis, and a New Subtheory. The first piece of data I'm going to share is a story that was published in 1648. And believe it or not, it is the first of all Mormon stories. And that is because it is the story of Mormon himself. Now, I devote an entire chapter to this in how the Book of Mormon came to pass. So I'm going to go through it at a much higher level and relatively quickly here. This man is Mormon. He is standing in a cauldron, lecturing the chefs in the room on how to prepare himself so that he can be served as his own last meal. It is a political cartoon of sorts, which appeared in many places, but most importantly, it served as the frontispiece in the first and third of a series of burlesque novels that started circulating in Paris in the 1640s. The name of the third book was L'Upal Mormon Histoire Comique, which translates to Mormon the Parasite, a comic history. Now, this is the reason why the name of the main character is Mormon. In French culture and literature, there is a tradition, which nowadays is called verlan, in which the syllables of a two-syllable word are switched to form a new word that has some clever relationship to the original word. And that relationship could be a synonym, an antonym, or even a pun, or something else. In this case, it was the reversal of the syllables of the surname of a Jesuit priest who was a professor of Oriental languages at the University of Paris. His name was Pierre de Monmort, and here is an engraving of him off to the right, as published in Histoire de Pierre de Monmort by Salingua. In his personal life, he was known for being such a voracious eater that they called him a parasite. Later, it was found out that he was also a plagiarist, that he essentially wrote pseudepigrapha and tried to pass off his made-up constructions specifically by, quote, experimenting with obscure ancient literary forms, which today we might call chiasmus, and spending whole days toying with onomastics and anagrams, close quote. In time, they called him a literary parasite as well. And because he was a very prominent public figure and came from a very rich family, it was the scandal of the century. These burlesquers switched the syllables of Monmort's last name for several layered reasons, which I discuss in the book. One reason was to avoid being sued by the Monmort family. Another reason was because, as reported by scholars that I cite in this book, the French pronunciation of the Greek word mormo is, of course, mormon, which is also how you pronounce the verlan of Monmort. And mormo is the Greek monstrous that snatches misbehaving young children, sucks their blood, and or devours their bodies, which Guy Ménage, another burlesquer of Monmort, said was a fitting description for the parasite precisely because he was a glutton, a plagiarist, and a word-gargling gargoyle. So now I want to read for you a one-page summary of the story of the character Mormon as he appears inside of the book Mormon the Parasite. Okay? The name of the mainline narrator in this book is Louvon, which name means the wolf, who is also a minor character. Now, the book opens on a scene in which Mormon, the main character, there's a little bit of a trigger warning here, is bound to a stake and set to be burnt for some crime that he may or may not have committed. Spectators gossip that he is a sodomite, an atheist, and even a cannibal, having feasted upon the flesh of a human baby. One mobster goes into gory detail, intimating that he devoured all but the bones of his fraternal twin in utero, ate his way through the undigested contents of his dying mother's stomach, and emerged from her belly ready to consume his unexpecting father.
That's cool. That's like a cross between Stephen King's The Dark Half and Alien.
I know. Pretty grotesque stuff. These guys were layered and interesting, and they loved to write stories. But how could anyone be so horrible? Surely he should be put to death by burning at the stake. But the framing narrative, which is presented in media res, forces us to suspend our judgment until the denouement. Right. Louvon wants to get to the bottom of this mystery, which is why he is the one narrating the story. It turns out that 3 of the town's most lettered Parisians, Desjardins, Le Pointu, and La Poète, decide to give Mormon, who is, of course, a caricature of Pierre de Montmort, a taste of his own medicine by setting him up to be roasted alive by the easily influenced townspeople. In the first flashback, Desjardins, whose main name means of the gardens, uses flowery language to convince a priest who later testifies against Mormon at trial that what he is seeing through a hole, which Desjardins has drilled into a wall, is in fact an act of passionate sodomy. In reality, however, Desjardins has hired a female prostitute to cross-dress as a man so as to get admitted into the all-male building so that she might then secretly satisfy her Mormon client. Similarly, Le Pointu, whose name means the sharp point, uses unblunted rhetoric and a plethora of puns to tell his story within the story. Near the end of it, he has Mormon the parasite emphatically read sentences from a recherche tract on atheism while seated in a semi-private space. Unbeknownst to Mormon, Le Pointu has discreetly planted a few well-conditioned witnesses so that upon hearing, but not seeing, Mormon's disquisition, the onlookers are ready to testify that he must have been freely speaking his own mind as an indurate atheist himself, which is, of course, against the law. Le Poète is the last informant to facilitate the entrapment of Mormon and is even less reliable. In the end, however, Mormon escapes capital punishment at the 11th hour, not because his own rhetoric was more flowery, pointed, or poetic than that of his accusers, but because, out of pity and tradition, he is granted his last request. He implores the judicial officials to carefully inspect the sex organs of his male-presenting paramour, which they gladly do, thus revealing to the crowd that he is actually a she. Mormon is instantly vindicated, the tables are turned, and the parallel accusations are suddenly introverted. The now enlightened mob then faces an uncomfortable dilemma. Which is worse, a man who, as a baby, was rumored to have feasted on blood, or the 3 rabble-rousers who are manifestly out for it? Into the metaphorical cauldron go Desjardins, Le Pointu, and La Poète, another subtle reference to the frontispiece. They, too, will get scalded and scorched for sporting their sophistry in the service of selfishness and spite. The volte-face of the ending, however, does more than underscore the arbitrariness of narration and the omnipotence of the author and the unreliability of witness testimony. It, quote, parodies the peripeteia of the contemporary novel and demonstrates that no amount of seasoned eloquence can substitute for reasoned evidence. As always, the truth will either condemn you or set you free, Valle wishes to say. In the heretical story, Mormon is ironically saved from the wages of sodomitic sin, which is death, by the evidence of heterosexual lust, itself one of the 7 deadly sins. In real life, Monmor, the incarnate chiasm of Mormon, is condemned by the evidence that he made up his sources, and no amount of eloquence can save him from the court of public opinion. Full of taste buds, but without taste, he was a man of bad arts and of bad parts. To Valle, both Monmor and Mormon, the man and the caricature, they were nothing more than gluttonous parasites who, in word and deed, turned out to be exactly what they ate: a little too much of everything. All right, so that is my summary of the first Mormon story, which you can find in chapter 14. Now, before we take this information and analyze how it might affect our understanding of the various authorship theories of the Book of Mormon, I need to share with you another story. And it is the story of the first Nephi. It turns out that in the very same decade where Monmor, a French Jesuit priest and professor of Oriental languages, was making up his sources, writing pseudepigrapha, and getting caught, there was another Jesuit priest and professor of Oriental languages that was making up his sources, writing pseudepigrapha, and getting caught. His name was Athanasius Kircher, and some have called him the last man who knew everything. Athanasius Kircher was born in 1601 in Fulda, Germany. At the age of 10, he went to the papal seminary where he learned Hebrew mostly on his own, but supervised by a rabbi. 7 years later, he joined up with the Jesuits in Paderborn. A decade after that, during the 30 Years' War, several priests and nuns were tortured and killed, and Kircher, then stationed in Mainz, decided to get the hell out of Dodge, which is why he, and I'm going through all this very quickly here, the fuller story is in the first chapter of the book, which is why he submitted his, I'll call them mission papers, to the Vatican so that he might get transferred. He said that he wanted to go to China or maybe Egypt, but his transfer was denied on account of not being able to speak the relevant languages, which seems to have given him an idea. A couple of years later, he announced that he had found in the basement of the library of the Prince Elector of Mainz a long-lost manuscript that he said was written by a part Jewish, part Egyptian linguist who spoke Hebrew but could write in an intermediate form of Egyptian that was halfway between ancient hieroglyphics and modern Coptic. The name of this made-up source was Rabbi Barachias Nephi. Kircher said that after studying Nephi's manuscript, he had figured out how to translate several characters from ancient Egyptian, and so pretty quickly he was transferred to Rome and became the Vatican's chief obelisk consultant. Over 3 decades, he published 3 different major works on the topic. The first was Prodromus Coptus, which means Coptic forerunner. In other words, the language before Coptic in the evolution from hieroglyphics to Coptic. Now, Kircher himself didn't use the word Reformed Egyptian because he didn't speak English, but that is clearly his meaning. Excuse me. Kircher declared that this was the first key to unlocking the ancient wisdom that had been preserved in the pyramids of Egypt. The second key, which you're seeing on screen, which he published in 1643, was Lingua Egyptiaca Restituta, which he upheld as, quote, a complete translation of Nephi's Coptic Arabic manuscript, close quote, which again, Nephi himself had supposedly written, which is a made-up source. In 1652, he published Oedipus Egyptiacus, which he himself said was, quote, a complete restoration of the hieroglyphic doctrine and of all the lost secrets of religion. At roughly the same time, the Catholic Church was religiously imperializing parts of Mexico, and missionaries there were sending back to Kircher codices from the Aztecs and the Mayans. Here's another quote that I'm now reading off the screen. After devoting himself to the study of Mexican gods and codices kept in the Jesuit collections at the Colegio Romano, Kircher boasted that Catholic missionaries in Asia and America had rediscovered the message of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of the Chinese and the Aztecs, close quote. But there is still more data concerning the life and works of Athanasius Kircher that we need to talk about before we can move on to the next phase. Kircher was desperate to be the Leonardo da Vinci of his day. More than a mere polyglot, he fancied himself to be an all-around polymath. He got his doctoral degree from the pontifical system after defending his dissertation on spiritual electromagnetism. He believed that spiritual energy, magnetic energy, and electric energy were all different manifestations of the same thing. Some scholars have even attributed the coining of the term electromagnetism to him, which other scholars say is not entirely accurate. It seems that Kircher himself may have actually plagiarized his dissertation from that of another student, specifically Johann J. Zweikart, according to Kircher expert John E. Fletcher. For Kircher, magnetism was both an indication and a radiation of spiritual energy, which could vary from day to day as a function of personal righteousness. He even concluded that spiritual electromagnetism was the mechanism by which the apostle Peter, like Jesus, was able to repel Earth's magnetic field and thus was able to walk on water. That is, until his faith wavered. To demonstrate this principle, he made scores of glass globes and put them in what contemporaries were calling his cabinet of curiosities, which eventually became a full-fledged museum in the Colegio Romano, which you can see in this far-right engraving. In German, incidentally, Kircher called it his Wunderkammer. In English, they called these artifacts the Curiosities of Kircher. It takes little imagination to fathom why someone would later describe them as balls of curious workmanship in the Book of Mormon. The ones that I have enlarged here are by no means the entire collection, but I chose these because they well illustrate some particularly salient features when it comes to shedding light on who wrote certain passages that now appear in the Book of Mormon. Notice how the vast majority of these balls, which were quite often made of glass, but sometimes brass and sometimes both, all contain pointers, as indicated by these red arrows. Now look a little more closely. Notice how the pointers are holding spindles. And now a little more closely still, many of those spindles are pointing to writings that appear on the sides of those glass globes. Now, in the book, I go into a fair amount of detail about how these exhibits and many other exhibits of curious workmanship, how they operate, usually with large bar magnets attached to axles that rotate by means of hidden pulleys and other such mechanisms. But they are all meant to demonstrate in some way the principle of spiritual magnetism. That when you hold the glass globe in your hands, it seemingly gets charged up by your own spiritual energy, which ostensibly causes the pointers and spindles to change their orientation according to your own personal righteousness. Of course, in reality, the pointers and spindles move because a hidden bar magnet somewhere is moving by some mechanism, which is, of course, hidden from the observer. Kircherisms are a new kind of anachronism. I hope it is pretty transparent at this point what we are building towards. Kircherisms as this new class of anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. Some of us already know that anachronisms are people, objects, and ideas from one time period that appear nonsensically in writings attributed to a different period. An account of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree with a chainsaw, for example, could not have been written until sometime after the invention of the chainsaw. The following 6 Kircherisms appear in the Book of Mormon and consequently demand some explanation for how they got there. The first character in the Book of Mormon is Nephi. Nephi is guided by a spiritually magnetic compass, which is a spherical ball made of brass that has pointers, spindles, and writing on its sides. It only works when its holder maintains a state of personal righteousness, which idea, I assert, is clearly based on Kircher's concept of spiritual magnetism. Nephi makes use of brass and golden plates, chiseling into them the untold religious history of the New World, going back to the Tower of Babel. Now, I don't have the time to go into it here. I covered a lot of it on the Mormonish podcast, but most people don't know that the copper plates that Kircher commissioned for his books, and he produced over 44 of them, were actually made of brass so that they would not oxidize as quickly. Large print run projects would require brass with a higher percentage of zinc, which would make the plates have a more golden color, between 15 to 25%. Kircher commissioned over 400 such golden brass copper plates, more than any other author in history, which could be, or maybe not, another Kircherism. The Book of Mormon contains a rediscovered message of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of the Aztecs, with Jesus Christ showing himself to white Native Americans who are referred to as Nephites in the text. I'm sure we all know. The entire narrative presents itself as having been written in a reformed Egyptian language, which Nephi can somehow write, though it is not clear how he would have learned it, which is also true of Kircher's Barachias Nephi. And then the last point that I'm calling my 6 main Kircherisms, Mormon, which is derived from Monmor, is the eponymous prophet historian who serves as the chief architect of the Book of Mormon. It is, of course, plausible that the Kircherisms are coincidental, though that is extremely improbable given their specificity and context. Nephi and Mormon are extremely rare proper nouns and both allude to fictitious sources fabricated in the 1630s by Jesuit priests, who are also professors of Oriental languages. They are the titular and bookending characters of the Book of Mormon. It would seem that Kircher chose Nephi as the name of his slippery rabbi because it was a name from the Catholic canon, but not in the canon of the rest of Christianity, which might cause his Catholic contemporaries to question the authenticity of the source less. Kircher was also known to have been fascinated by the Nephilim, a Hebrew word that is often translated as giants. He even put large bones on display in his Museo Kircheriano, saying specifically that he had found the bones of the Nephilim. Well, it's hard to know for sure, but Kircher probably liked the idea that his made-up Nephi was a giant in the field of linguistics. In terms of his other name, Baruch means blessed in Arabic, with Barachias being the corresponding Greek transliteration, thus giving him a cosmopolitan name that worked well for his backstory. And because in the Bible, Barachias, the father of Zacharias, was murdered between the altar and the sanctuary, Kircher hoped that this second name would confer some gravitas. Okay, I've just shared a bunch of new stuff that I presume is totally new to most, if not all, of our listeners. There's a lot more new stuff in the book, but right now I want to move on with the high-level outline from the title of the presentation and start to analyze what these Kircherisms might mean in terms of the various authorship theories that have been proposed. Then we can ask ourselves how we might modify any of those theories or generate new theories to accommodate this new data. First, we have the ancient authorship theory. Now, of course, there's not just one version of the ancient authorship theory. Better said, this entire gray box is a category, and it is a family of sub-theories that share certain common elements. And these sub-theories evolve over time. When I was a kid, there was no rock and a hat. Now there is. For our non-Mormon listeners, I would summarize a representative subtheory of this category as follows. The content of the book was composed by literal ancient American prophets onto gold plates that were eventually handed to Joseph Smith by an angel, maybe Nephi, maybe Moroni, either one. Smith then puts his seer stone in a white top hat to block out the normal light that the spiritual light in the stone, so that the spiritual light in the stone would have more contrast. After which he tightly or loosely translates ancient scripture, dictating the resulting paragraphs to his scribes. He might or might not have used ancient spectacles that might or might not have been buried with the golden plates and might or might not have been the Urim and Thummim. Now, how can this theory accommodate the Kircherisms? One way is to say that the Kircherisms are just a crazy cosmic coincidence, but nothing more than that. And some people might be satisfied with that explanation. But how different is that, honestly, from dismissing evidence that you don't like without carefully analyzing it? Most of us would say that such would not be an academically responsible answer, but then again, most people subscribing to the ancient authorship theory aren't really interested in thinking it through at a deeper level. Now, if I were a believing Mormon still, I'd rationalize it by saying that the devil, who is so clever, must have put it into Kircher's mind to give the name Nephi to his made-up source, and must have inspired him to invent his spherical spiritual compasses precisely because Satan knew that it would be a stumbling block to people 400 years into the future. Okay, that's another modification. Maybe you can think of other ways of rationalizing the Kircherisms under the ancient authorship theory. Most of us on the show are probably past that, but such is the exercise. Next, to the ancient authorship category, we have another category, which is another family of subtheories, which we call the sole authorship theory, that Joseph Smith Jr., between the ages of 22 and 23, with essentially no education, and despite having spent the prior several years roaming the countryside in search of buried treasure as both a pastime and an occupation, nonetheless single-handedly composed all the sentences in the Book of Mormon himself through creative writing, automatic writing, or inspired dictation. He never received any manuscripts or golden plates from anyone, not from Nephi or Moroni, not from Solomon Spalding, and not from Sidney Rigdon. However, he might or might not have fabricated his own set of tin or copper plates, which he might or might not have painted gold for the purpose of catalyzing or channeling a spiritual experience, either for himself or for carefully chosen witnesses. Those experiences might or might not have involved alcohol, entheogenic mushrooms, or other vision-enhancing substances. Because Kircherisms are a brand new concept as of this book, the current proponents of prior sole authorship subtheories have not yet divided themselves into camps based on whether they see the Kircherisms in the Book of Mormon as resulting from coincidence or intentionality. Will Danvogel, Brent Metcalf, John Hamer, Richard Bushman, and other sole authorship enthusiasts conclude that the 6 Kircherisms are all crazy coincidence? Maybe, and that is their right. If so, I personally don't see most thinking people agreeing with that. If, however, after analyzing all the details that I put in the book, they come to the conclusion that the Kircherisms are real and intentional, how will that cause them to change how they think about the process by which Smith, under the sole authorship theory still, would have constructed the Book of Mormon? They're going to have to make Smith out to be somehow a world-class expert on Athanasius Kircher and Pierre de Monmort. And that is a very big claim. Hardly anyone in Smith's milieu knew anything about Kircher at all. Nonetheless, for completeness, I explore some rather improbable possibilities for how Smith might have become so well read on Kircher. because that is the responsible way to conduct mechanistic research. We should always try to come up with every creative alternative we can, and then to steelman all the subtheories as much as possible before we start to attack them, whether we like them or not. Before moving on to the next category, I want to talk about the fraud spectrum, with Smith being preeminently pious at one end and being fully fraudulent at the other. One of the more popular subtheories within this category falls on the spectrum in the middle, with Smith being a, quote, pious fraud. That is the version that Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalf subscribe to. Of all the subtheories within the sole authorship theory, I personally believe that that is the best capable of explaining the greatest share of the historical data, but not all of it. In other words, I like it best inside of the category, even though it has a ton of problems. In the end, I think that the community will see a better theory, one that doesn't have to dismiss any data, and one that better agrees with what we know about the education and personalities of the people involved. For completeness, this is the fraud spectrum of Joseph Smith under the ancient authorship theory, where most people assume that Smith was totally pious, repented of his sins, called, and chosen. Okay. This next category is the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith family of subtheories. For the purposes of this discussion today, I'm going to limit the universe of discourse to just these three categories: the ancient authorship theory, the sole authorship theory, and the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory. Of course, there are several others like the Ethan Smith authorship theory, or the entire Smith family project theory, or the Smith stole Spalding's manuscript in some other way theory. I discuss those theories and their sub-theories in the book, but there is no reason to bog down this discussion with them. I was complete in the book, but of necessity, I have to be brief here. The common element in all sub-theories of the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory is that Rigdon obtained somehow a manuscript that had been written by Spalding. In time, he added things to it for whatever reason, got Smith involved somehow for whatever reason, and let Smith publish it on his own for whatever reason. Okay, so now I'm putting two fraud spectra under this category, one for Smith and one for Rigdon. And I'm going to ask the audience to put a little star on each spectrum where you think Smith and Rigdon might be, based on your prior exposure to whatever version of the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory that you have heard. I'll venture to guess that most, if not all of you, put both Smith and Rigdon all the way to the right, which is to say, with both persons being fully fraudulent. Everyone who has ever mentioned the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory has made a very serious, unchecked assumption that it must have been a villainous conspiracy. Why did this happen? This mistake didn't start with Fawn Brodie, who, by the way, only tangentially addressed the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory very briefly in her Appendix B, which historians and apologists alike admit contains several mistakes. Fawn Brodie never mentioned Kircher, not once in her biography of Joseph Smith, which is itself curious given the statements made by the famous Egyptologist E.A.W. Budge and many others in a conference on Egyptology that was held in Chicago in the year 1912. There, Budge said that Joseph Smith, quote, could be best explained as another Athanasius Kircher, close quote. I don't want to digress into that background here, but if you want to know more about that story, I discuss it in chapter 5. People don't realize that Fawn Brodie published her books in 1945, which was 80 years ago, when she was not yet 30 years old. She had no idea that the name of Kircher's made-up source was Nephi. She had no idea that Kircher's museum was famous for his spherical, spiritually magnetic balls of curious workmanship containing pointers, spindles, and writing on their sides. I believe that Brodie was an honest person doing her best, and she made a remarkable and timeless contribution, but she didn't have any way of knowing about these kinds of details about Athanasius Kircher. I believe that if she had studied Kircher's Prodromus Coptus before she was 30, she would have recognized that it could easily have been described as a reformed Egyptian language. I believe that if she had known that Kircher concluded that the hieroglyphic writings of the Aztecs and the Mayans had evolved from Egyptian and that they contained the message of Christianity, she would have said something about it. I believe that if she had known that several burlesque novels had been written about another fraudulent professor of Oriental languages who was Kircher's contemporary, Monmore, in which the syllables of his surname were switched according to the fun French tradition, she would have admitted these observations into her thinking and would have eventually entertained a version of the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory in which neither Smith nor Rigdon are made out to be villainous conspirators. So, Bill and RFM said at the beginning that I've come up with a new theory on the Book of Mormon's origins. More accurately, I am creating a new sub-theory within the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith category that agrees with what we all accept about Rigdon and Smith in terms of their fraud spectra, but under the other categories. In terms of the ancient authorship theory, everyone thinks that Rigdon was a great man, a great orator, a kind soul, a seeker of truth, humble, hardworking, and true. Under the sole authorship theory, again, everyone thinks that Rigdon was doing his best to be his best self. So why is it that in shifting our attention to the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith category of subtheories, no one has ever tried to assume positive intent? Is that Edie Howe's fault? Maybe. Is it Brodie's fault? Well, it would have made her biography impossible to write based on the information that she had at the time, and I am so glad that she did. But what about the modern day? Of course, it is not in the self-interest of Mormon historians to spend any time constructing a better Spalding-Rigdon-Smith sub-theory, and non-Mormon historians, whom I have talked to and shared my research, are not going to put their name on anything that significantly challenges the origin story of the Book of Mormon. One of them told me that doing so would make him look like a bigot and that it would be career suicide. Lars,
Who was that again? What was the name of that person?
I can't tell you. I asked him if I could say his name. But I can show you. But I can prove it to you through emails so that you can see. But I can't put his name.
I'm taking your word for it. Just interjecting a little levity.
Yeah. One guy said, "Lars, you're going to get yourself killed," which I don't think is true at all. But it goes to show how difficult it is for non-Mormon historians to do research the way that it would be done and is done in healthier fields and disciplines. Why? Because if such non-Mormon historians were to say anything too controversial, what would happen? What does happen? They don't get access to all the good materials, which the church and BYU locks up in their vaults, so they don't kick against the pricks. But who is putting the pricks on the wagon? The Brighamite Mormon Church did. Now, I apologize to the audience in advance, but I'm going to go on a very short rant to all the BYU and other Mormon professors that attacked the reputation of Matthew Jockers and Craig Criddle after they published their computational linguistics paper in 2008. Shame on you. Jockers and Criddle did scholarly research, which was peer-reviewed. It had a few flaws. You didn't like it, but instead of producing your own peer-reviewed rebuttal in an academic journal, which was your responsibility, you attacked their character and you were rude to them in professional settings. Well, it's been 16 years and you still haven't produced anything peer-reviewed on that topic. Why is that? Okay, so I'm done ranting about that. But on the topic of being angry,
By the way, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Lars, you're going to get into the results of that before you're done tonight, right?
I'm sorry, which results?
The
Oh,
Jock
the Craig
Criddle
Criddle study? We can talk about it. Yeah, I don't have a slide on it.
I mean, just basically, I understand that their results were that as far as their analysis of word usage and all the stuff they did, very scientific, some flaws, some criticisms. I don't know about the specifics, but their basic findings were that of the authors whose writings they used to compare against the text of the Book of Mormon, the two that had the highest incidence of similarity were Sidney Rigdon and Solomon Spalding. Is that correct?
That's right. But what's much more fun than that, so their methodology was based on what's called nearest sunken centroid analysis. And you use common words, not words like behold and thou, but common words like if and into and between and of. And it turns out that every person has a different frequency of usage of those common words in their speak. And there is enough, with enough common words and with enough sample text, you can actually get a pretty robust profile such that, I mean, people have discovered plagiarisms and frauds and forgeries and thefts and things like that. It's been in the news, which it's a fun discipline. Well, with the sampling of the writings that they had, they concluded that certain portions of the book, and they lay them out at chapter by chapter, had higher probabilities of authorship attribution to Spalding or to Rigdon or to someone else, right? And they had control authors and all of this. This is a rigorous methodology. But the fundamental flaw in the study was they didn't use any writings from Smith that were not known to have been written by Smith himself and not influenced by a scribe. Because when you sit down and compose something yourself, it's different than if you have someone who's writing it down and you're dictating. You're in a different composition mindset. The person might change some things. And because they didn't control for the writings of Joseph Smith that are known to have been separated from scribes earlier, they just didn't do enough work in that area. And I call that out in the book as a flaw, as other people have. But they have then since done more work on that, and I've been in private communication with them, and I cite the unpublished results in the book. But they haven't published another paper on it. And Matthew Jocker says that he's not going to because of the way that he was treated by BYU professors. And so I say if their results stand until someone comes up with a better paper and a better analysis, I think that BYU professors probably did, and they didn't like the results, and so they're not going to publish anything about it. That's a possibility. If they're going to complain about it and they're not going to publish anything about it, they kind of lose standing for speaking. That's the way I look at it. Does that answer your question? All right. So, all right, going back on the topic of being angry, I was so angry just a minute ago. I have a question that I would like to post to all post-Mormons and have you take seriously. Is it possible that the real reason why no one, from E.D. Howe to Lars Nielsen, was able to entertain a non-conspiratorial Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory, where Rigdon was preeminently pious and Smith was a pious fraud, or better than a pious fraud, is because we are still angry. We need someone to be the villain because we don't like the idea that we were duped. We have a hardwired biological need to concentrate our blame onto one or two people. We don't need to put that anger, which is real, which is justified, has to be processed, often with years of professional help like I went through. But we don't need to put that anger into the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith category anymore. Without that anger, we can now see the forest and the trees at the same time. And here's the good news. Burnham Wood has finally come to Dunster Castle. For those of you who are interested in brushing up your Shakespeare, where is that from, RFM?
Wasn't it Dunsinane? Yes, Macbeth.
There you go. All right. So let me move on to a more parsimonious subtheory. Momentarily, I will present what I think is the most parsimonious subtheory on the topic of how the Book of Mormon came to pass. What do I mean by parsimonious? Fewer authors, this is so important, fewer authors is not necessarily synonymous with fewer assumptions. And that is the big mistake, and that so many of us heretofore, including me, have made. It turns out that you have to make a lot of unchecked assumptions about Joseph Smith under even the very best version of the sole authorship theory, which again is the Dan Vogel pious fraud subtheory, in my opinion. In this new subtheory, you don't have to assume that Smith somehow became a 22-year-old world expert on Hebraisms and chiasms and the Apocrypha and Isaiah and the Book of Enoch or Athanasius Kircher. Why did anyone ever think that Smith was such an expert on those and other things at such a young age? For the first 100 years, no one did. He had essentially no schooling, okay, maybe a year, and according to his mother, he was the least interested of the children in the perusal of books. Emma said that he could not write a coherent sentence, and he didn't know that Jerusalem had walls. I think that these women were telling the unexaggerated truth, at least on this point. Later in life, both would stretch the truth for their own reasons, which probably increased the more that they saw Joseph stretching the truth. But from the beginning to the present day, no active Mormon has ever claimed that Smith was anything more than an ignorant farm boy at the time that the Book of Mormon was coming together. And they are right. It is true that he learned a few things later in life about Hebrew and even hieroglyphics, but that was years after the Book of Mormon had been published. Many years ago, John Dehlin asked David Bockavoy, whom I love, whom I used to home teach when we were both active in Belmont, Massachusetts. John Dehlin asked him how, as a scholar, he thought about Joseph Smith, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing this, well, we know that Joseph Smith was an amazing scholar on Isaiah, and how do we know that? Because of the Book of Mormon. He went on to say that there is enough complexity in the Book of Mormon on the topic of Isaiah alone to conclude that Smith must have been a literary genius and quite accomplished in his understanding of Isaiah. Again, I'm paraphrasing. The most parsimonious explanation is that someone else studied Isaiah quite deeply. That's it. We need to be more careful about the pernicious ways in which circular reasoning has worked itself into arguments that we have too easily accepted. And that is as far as my criticism of David Bockavoy, one statement, will ever go. We don't need to create some weird expansion theory, which was popularized by Blake Ostler, to account for how anciently certain parts of the Book of Mormon really do seem amidst the obvious 19th century additions. A much more parsimonious explanation is that someone intended to write a Kircheresque ancient American history mostly for fun, as countless witnesses in Conneaut, Ohio and Amity, Pennsylvania testified that Spalding did. We can finally believe many people at face value who weren't Mormons or ex-Mormons and who had nothing to gain by lying. And we don't need to make up terms like collective mass memory distortion across scores of people and multiple towns and multiple decades in order to dismiss the things that you don't like that support the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory. Even Royal Skousen has said in public forums that in the parts of the Book of Mormon that were not copied from the KJV and that do not contain sermons, the word choice and the particular usages of certain words strongly point to Smith having written those parts as if he were living in 1 or 2 generations before his own. Trust me, you do not want to hear his faith-promoting explanation for that. Again, a much more parsimonious explanation is that someone who really was 1 or 2 generations older than Smith wrote those parts of the Book of Mormon. Okay, so here it is in a nutshell. Solomon Spalding was very intelligent, very creative, and a good writer, and a little more sleepy than Mark Twain, perhaps, but still a good writer. He had both a bachelor's and a master's degree from Dartmouth College. He studied the Bible deeply. He took advanced language courses from his professor of Oriental languages, and I shouldn't even put that in air quotes. That was the official title of his professor, Professor John Smith, who just happens to be related to our Joseph Smith in that they are second cousins twice removed, according to Rick Behrens. This advanced language training included both Hebrew and Coptic Egyptian, again, as reported by Rick Behrens. In this capacity, Solomon Spalding went deep on the life and works of Athanasius Kircher. He may have even written his master's thesis on Kircher, this is speculation, which volume appears in the 1809 catalog of books maintained by Dartmouth College, where Professor John Smith was also the campus librarian. That book, however, is now missing, unfortunately. Incidentally, Professor Smith also managed a rare book dealership that he ran out of his own home for several years before moving the business to Hanover.
Lars, can I stop you here? I
Yeah.
apologize because I'm trying to give you the floor, but this book that you mentioned strikes me as important. Now, are you saying that there's a record of that book in a card catalog or something as having existed, or what? And is this
Yeah.
a book about Kircher?
We don't know. And that's what's interesting. We know there in the 1809 catalog, it's called the Spalding Lectures, but we don't have any metadata on the contents, and we know that it's missing. And I dug and I asked people at the Rauner Special Collections at Dartmouth, and we hoped that it was misfiled. Couldn't find it anywhere. More work might reveal something, but it looks like it's lost. Maybe
Okay, thank
it's
you for explaining that.
possible. But that book wouldn't have been something like a prelude to the Book of Mormon or a first draft or something like that. That book would have been his master's thesis.
And I apologize. The significance of that and why you're bringing it up here is what?
Because it's possible that if that were to be discovered, and I've got lots of things that are on my list and things that I would invite people to chase down, how nice would it be if we were to find that book somewhere and see that there were Kircherisms in it, or that evidence that Solomon Spalding had learned about Kircher to the level of detail that we see in the Book of Mormon. That would be a great find. And that's what I've been doing, right? I've been going to all of these basements and getting microfilm, and I'm looking for clues. And so I'm telling you a little bit about what it's like and what I'm looking for when I'm doing these things.
Okay, thank you. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So I just talked about him running a rare book dealership out of his own home, which he then moved to town. At some point, Spalding wrote, and so this is a theory I'm telling you. So don't mix, fact. It's all under the idea of like, this is what I'm telling you my theory is. At some point, Spalding wrote a Kircher-esque origin story for the Native Americans that he wanted to present as a veritable Biblia Americana, probably in a way to burlesque Cotton Mather, who wrote a book called Biblia Americana, in which the beginning of the book is a retelling of the creation story that is a new book of Moses. So he probably was thinking about burlesquing that by writing this Biblia Americana, just for fun, right? Whether he came up with this idea entirely on his own, or because parts of the idea had been given to him by his professor of Oriental languages, is something that can be debated. I provide evidence in my book, which has never been discussed by Mormon historians, but was digitized for the first time by the truly amazing Dale Broadhurst, that Professor Smith may have given Spalding the beginnings of this Kircheresque novel. So listen to this block quote from an article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Block quote: Reverend Dr. Smith wrote a work on this subject, which after completion he decided not to publish, fearing that it might injure his reputation as a theological writer. This book was an elaboration of the theory Dr. Smith had so long maintained, taking as its foundation the migration of the lost tribes of Israel to the Western continent. It described the Hegira from Palestine, the establishment of the Jews in what is now Central America and Mexico, the founding of a great empire, and its gradual decline and fall. It told of magnificent cities inhabited by an enlightened and Christian people, the author claimed for them a civilization equal to that of Egypt or Jerusalem. Hundreds of years passed, and the history of the Eastern Jews was repeated on the Western continent. Quarrels between the various tribes sprang up, bloody wars were waged, and the process of disintegration began. Gradually, the people were scattered, their cities destroyed, and all semblance to a nation was lost. Thousands perished by pestilence and the sword, and the remnants of a once mighty nation relapsed into a state of barbarism. Their descendants, Dr. Smith claimed, were Indians of North America and the Aztecs of Mexico. This is almost exactly similar to the story told in the Book of Mormon. Solomon Spalding, this is still the block quote, Solomon Spalding was a warm admirer of Dr. Smith, and when a young man studied under his tuition. He became interested in his theories regarding the settlement of America, and in return, Dr. Smith took the young student into his confidence and granted of his unpublished book. Spalding was deeply impressed with the truth of this theory and pursued his investigations even further than Dr. Smith had ventured. Taking the latter's views as expressed in his book, Spalding some years later wrote his famous manuscript Found, which afterward fell into the hands of Joe Smith and was reconstructed into the Book of Mormon. Indeed, it is not at all unlikely that Dr. Smith's original manuscript, which it is said Spalding had in his possession, suffered a similar fate. At any rate, it has never been seen since. Close block quote. Okay, just to recap so far, and we are not done with building out this sub-theory, Spalding wrote a very convincing Kircheresque novel that may or may not have been based on something given to him by Professor John Smith. Whether he did or not is not a linchpin in this theory, but it's context and support, and it helps to provide context for how it is that Solomon Spalding may have received these Kircherisms either through a source text, as this source says it he did, or that he might have received it as an influence, having been his student, having taken his graduate courses, having studied Hebrew and Coptic Egyptian under him. It would be almost impossible for him to not have learned from the professor of Oriental languages in America about Athanasius Kircher. It's almost impossible to imagine that John Smith wouldn't have talked to Solomon Smith about that. But again, that's part of the theory. Spalding then became a Dartmouth missionary, roaming among the tribes, learning their ways, and getting ideas for more things to add to his Kircheresque novel. And he did this for 10 years. He selflessly lost himself in service for many of them, but as he studied deeper and deeper, he slowly reasoned himself out of organized religion and became an atheist. He set his story aside until 1809, when he got word that Professor John Smith had died. He himself had suffered a severe rupture of the spine, which caused him to stoop for the rest of his life, and so he decided that if he was going to finish the novel, it was then or never. So he resurrected the Kircheresque novel, finished it, refined it painstakingly with great detail so that it would surely pass a preliminary inspection as ancient American scripture, which took him 4 years. But he also threw in some Easter eggs, some dead giveaways that it was pure fiction all along. Those Easter eggs were the Kircherisms that I discussed earlier in this presentation. Authors do this. They choose the names of their main characters very carefully and thoughtfully. Nephi and Mormon, historically important names alluding to pseudepigrapha and made-up sources for ancient texts, are two ancient-sounding, Egyptian-sounding names that unmistakably say, but only to those who are at least as educated as Solomon Spalding, this work is just fun biblical fan fiction. It amused him to think that people would believe his story to be scripture, which is why he wrote it that way. Now, we all know that he started telling this story to the townspeople in Conyet and Ohio and Amity, Pennsylvania. People called him Old Come to Pass, Even 20 years later, when missionaries came to Conneaut, people remembered these stories and said, "You're telling me, you Mormon missionaries, the same story that Solomon Spalding told." And then Justice of the Peace Aaron Wright says, "Old come to pass has come to life again," in the newspaper. And this is a Justice of the Peace. We don't need to dismiss these people's testimonies because we can't really figure out whether it was a conspiracy theory or not. There is a better way. Now, I said Solomon Spalding intentionally wrote this fiction to be ancient American scripture. He also wrote a prelude to that story, which is now called the Oberlin Manuscript. It should be obvious to everyone who reads it carefully, which honestly, no one ever does, that the Fabius story is a prelude to the Nephite and Jaredite stories and an extension of the same ideas and themes. Even the sword of Laban that cuts off the head of its former owner in the Nephite story appears in the Fabius story as the sword of Labanco, also cutting off the head of its former owner. You guys have talked about it a lot on this podcast. You did several episodes on it, but the naming patterns, the place names, the onomastics, everything points to it all have been written by the same person with the same goals and as part of the same project, which claim I back up in the book with extraordinary detail. I devote an entire chapter to comparing the Fabius text, the Oberlin manuscript, to the Book of Mormon and the Jaredite, and to other texts that we'll get to that have to do with, that we know that Solomon Spalding wrote that appeared in the Library of Congress. And there are Kircherisms across the spectrum. There are similar phraseology. We did more computational linguistics. This is the Craig Criddle work that I told you before that's unpublished that shows that the phraseology in the Romance of Celeste, that new manuscript, matches up perfectly with the chapters of the Book of Mormon that are not copied from the KJV and are not the sermons that would have been interjected by Rigdon, as well as the Oberlin manuscript. So I triangulate a lot of peer-reviewed data and new data to make this point that the Fabius story, the Oberlin manuscript, is a prelude to one big story. There was not separate manuscripts and separate stories. It was all one story, which I like to call stories from lost manuscripts found or truncated manuscript found. And the prelude to the Nephi and Jaredite story was the Fabius story. Okay.
Lars, just jumping in here for a second, just let you know we're at 117, actually 118 now. I know that we talked a little bit at the first. I've asked a couple questions just to give you a time stamp here. Do you think you'll be able to wind this up in the next 25 or 30 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yep. I think we're in a good spot.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, Sidney Rigdon was the quintessential seeker of truth. He had no formal education, but he perspicaciously read everything he could find relative to the Bible. He was a successful minister, a great orator, and unfortunately suffered from then untreatable mental health issues. He also suffered a contusion of the brain due to an incident with a horse when he was young. As a journeyman tanner and courier, he also breathed toxic levels of harsh fumes every day, except Sundays. To get revelation, he would fast and pray for more than just days at a time. At some point, he holds in his hand a manuscript that seemed like ancient American scripture in so many particulars that he had to believe, actually he wanted to believe that it was true. He didn't know whether it was, so he asks God in faith with exhaustive prayer and fasting, believing that it is true, hoping that it is true. And because the warm feeling that it might be true continues in his heart, he concludes that it must be true and that God has chosen him specifically to have it. That manuscript speaks to him, saying that not even 100th part of the record in his hands has been translated. But there was a cave full of golden plates from which this record was translated by someone who was evidently inspired of God. This is what he's thinking. Rigdon wants to find that cave filled with the kind of treasure that cannot corrupt. Where could he read even more ancient American scripture? but he doesn't know how to find it. Now, there were some clues, for example, in the place names within the manuscript, but that wasn't enough. And he was so busy. He was living in Bainbridge, Ohio, and was the father of 5 children. And with his congregations and revivals and projects, he needed help. But he knew better than to announce publicly what he had. Eventually, he shared his pearl of great price with his assistant, Parley P. Pratt, who had been living in Palmyra the summer before with his uncles, Ira and Alan Pratt. Pratt told Rigdon that there was a man from Palmyra who had the ability to find the hidden treasures of the earth. Pratt believed that Smith had the gift of second sight, as did so many others, even though Smith had never obtained any tangible treasures. Rigdon made it a matter of prayer and fasting. He felt a confirmation that Pratt should go back to Palmyra and entice Smith to have a meeting with Rigdon. James Gordon Bennett talks about this in his newspaper article. You guys covered it on a previous episode. Rigdon believes in Smith. He reassures Smith that should he put away the follies of his youth and set his heart not upon the monetary treasures of the world, but the spiritual treasures that are crying out to us from the dust, like the manuscript that Rigdon had in his hands, that then and only then would the Lord allow Smith to obtain the plates. Now, Smith was a con man, or at least he had been a con man. There is no dispute about this. But did Smith earnestly try to reform himself? Did he try to model himself after Rigdon? And did he try to emulate his manner of speaking and writing? I say that he did. I choose to give 22-year-old Joseph Smith, even though I still hate what he did to all those women and the men that he called friends much later in life, I choose to give that young man the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he did con Rigdon like he did so many others, but I don't think so. I think that Smith conned himself like I did, like most of us in this audience did. Smith finally had a good role model in Sidney Rigdon, the first good role model in his life, not his father, who was always drunk, and let's face it, where there is poverty, unemployment, and too much alcohol, there is almost always violence. Not Lumen Walters. I think that Smith believed Rigdon when Rigdon told him that perhaps the Lord had been preparing him and calling him for years to use his seer stone, but for righteous purposes. Smith convinced himself that seeing the plates in his mind's eye, while his physical eyes were still open, was seeing the plates. And so he said it like that. And people believed it like that, which pattern was repeated over and over with his witnesses and his scribes. I think Dan Vogel is right that Smith made his own set of plates, not to trick people in the end, but because it was a way for Smith to make them real. Folk magicians like him would make a Jupiter talisman and then imbue it with magical power. They would make lamens and then imbue them with magical quality. Like Ann Taves, I think that Smith made his own set of plates, probably 10 or so sheets of copper or tin, which he may or may not have painted, so that through ritual lustration, they could become, through transubstantiation, the plates that he needed them to be, so that he could bring to pass the things that Rigdon, whom he believed was sincere, because he was, had told him that he was foreordained to do. Now, it is possible that Smith ended up using some misdirection to get where he wanted to go. Absolutely, he did. Which is why the star on this spectrum is not all the way to the left under the word pious. In my opinion, Joseph Smith was a pious fraud. But that is the extent of the treachery. It does not need to be some vast conspiratorial network. Now, some of you might be thinking, but what about this detail? And what about that account? And the biography of Parley P. Pratt? I agree with you. The details matter. And I promise I fleshed them out very carefully in the book. RFM read it. You could testify maybe in my behalf. I was very careful to address all of these details very carefully. It is 390 pages. It could have been 690 pages, but I wanted something that was very accessible and that has more one-click online references in the footnotes than in any other book of Mormon history that you might have ever read. Now, here's the call to action for all those within the sound of this podcast. Don't just take this new data, this new analysis, and this new sub-theory on faith. Study, not just from my book, but from the best books. Unfortunately, we cannot trust Mormon historians to tell us the truth about our own history. Unfortunately, we cannot trust several, but not all, non-Mormon historians to step up and dive deep into this. And we can no longer let only a handful of Mormon enthusiasts be the gatekeepers of the sub-theories that will set us free. I am calling for a democratization of Mormon history. #open the vaults. There are enough of us spread out across post-Mormondom that we can refine the sub-theories and put to rest this 200-year-old mystery. Now is the time to do it. The longer we wait, the harder it will be. And here's an example of what I mean. During the Mormonish podcast that I gave last week, I talked about how there is a Solomon Spalding manuscript buried in the Library of Congress that I obtained and had professionally photographed. Later that night, I got an email from a church employee who said that he, I don't mind revealing his gender, had also found that manuscript and had taken pictures of every page with his smartphone, which he sent to me. I immediately sent him all the high-resolution photographs that I had, and we jumped on a Zoom call to talk about it. He was so angry that no one within the church was willing to even get the manuscript, let alone digitize it and study it, so he did it on his own dime. Now, I personally think that the church does have the manuscript, has digitized it, and has decided not to do anything about it, probably because it is not in their own best interest to do so. Okay, oops. Oh, there's the star on the Pies fraud. Sorry for not clicking that earlier. Okay, so here on my screen are pages 6 and 7 from Solomon Spalding's ecstatic journey through the heavens, his romance of Celeste. For context, Philander, whose name literally means lover of men, is the main character. He is modeled off Solomon Spalding himself, who is also a lover of men. According to historian Dale Broadhurst and others, it is very likely that Spalding was a closeted homosexual or a bisexual. Yes, Mr. Dallin H. Oakes, you heard me correctly. About 50% of the words on the pages to which you so desperately cleave were written by a closeted homosexual, and there was nothing counterfeit about him. He is your favorite author. Now, Shane Larson and Ryan Josiah, make sure you cut that up and put it on TikTok. Getting back to the text, Philander's adventures eventually take him to the Rocky Mountains, which he compares to a broken bowl whose fragments of grandeur and sublimity, this is in the upper left-hand corner red box, whose fragments of grandeur and sublimity afford shelter and serenity for all who wander this way in pursuit of the real Urim and Thummim. Okay, interesting phrase, does not a pattern make. Okay, well, what's over here on page 7? A voice called to me and said, "Friend, this night is redemption commenced in the Rocky Mountains, and the shaking shall not cease till all the dry bones in the valley of Oregon shall be clothed upon, and a nation shall arise to bless God in the spirit of holiness." "Who art thou?" said I, "and what hast thou to do with me in the name of the Lord?" He said, "Come and see." At this instant, I beheld a beautiful young man, clothed in a long robe with a princely coronet on his head, a brilliant lamp in one hand, and a golden harp in the other. All right, definitely a lot of mingling with scripture there. There's a bit of prophecy. It's happening in the Rocky Mountains. There's an angel whose name we will later discover is Florence, which is named after Florence, Italy, of course, whom Spalding/Philander falls in love with later on in the story. Incidentally, in the plot, Florence and Philander find hidden in a chasm in the middle of a cave in the Rocky Mountains a portal that allows them to travel anywhere in the universe, kind of like a wardrobe that opens up to a fascinating world of Christianity-laced fantasy. The two go to Jupiter, where they meet George Washington because that is where his mansion in heaven is. Fascinating stuff. Quite an imagination, Solomon Spalding. And his writing is full of poetry, song, quotations, scripture, and philosophy. Certainly worth someone writing it up. Now let's look at the last page. There we go. And God hath determined to show his power in the temporal kingdom by changing the ancient priesthood, which had always gone hand in hand with the kingdom of this world. It was determined that their chief speaker should assume the name and office of Prince Lamech, and usurp the throne of his father and claim the powers of heaven and hell. Incidentally, Lamech is a contraction of Laman and Enoch, which are obviously names from the Nephite and Jaredite texts. Lamech is also a character spelled two different ways in the Fabius story, which is again the prelude story that sets up the Spalding's Ancient American Scripture, which was the pre-Rigdon basis for the Book of Mormon. Let's continue. They left the mountain and pushed forward with all speed, for here upon the Garden of Eden was the royal palace. Okay, Spalding's talking about the Garden of Eden being in America. Maybe that's interesting, maybe it's not. What else? And they left the field like vanquished Jews who preferred death by their own hands to a captivity of Gentiles whom they professed to despise. The whole mountain had once been the basis of a vast watery meteor that almost depopulated the earth and peopled the moon. For context, Philander is saying that the Great Basin, in other words, the Salt Lake Valley, was created when a meteor made of water crashed into the Rocky Mountains, leaving a relatively shallow hole, which became the Great Salt Lake. Not at all interesting.
I think Rod Meldrum will be interested in this.
Right, I know, but not at all interesting to Mormons, I'm sure. Now, it is true that early Mormons had a crazy belief that the Garden of Eden was in America and that the moon was populated, but this is probably just more crazy parallelomania, right? You know what? You're right. I'm sure there's no good reason to ever transcribe it. What's next? The temple should be a lasting fortress for the good and faithful till the fullness of those times which are required to make this planet an everlasting mountain of holiness. Pity he didn't say everlasting hills. Having revolutionized the lunar kingdom, wait, like the glory of the moon? And established a priesthood of the order of Melchizedek, we joined the armies of Jupiter as they were again making suit to the earth. We first set foot upon the Rocky Mountains, being favored by the grace of God and divine teachings. And as you are now initiated into the society of the Florentines, you will excuse me from attempting to relate any further what eye hath not seen nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. But God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. The end. To Mormon historians, you don't get to decide whether you want to keep this information from Mormons and post-Mormons. To non-Mormon historians, we were trusting you to not hide these things that could be interesting to us, to some of us, and could speak to core issues of the high-demand belief system that we pledged our lives to for decades. You don't get to hide this from us either. To sole authorship theorists who knew about this and decided it would be better not to ever talk about it because it didn't agree with the paradigm that you ascribe to, that sounds a lot like Carrie Mulstein, who says, I start out with an assumption that the sole authorship theory is true, and anything else that we get from our study of Mormon history and any evidence I find, I will try to fit into that paradigm. So what else is the Mormon Church hiding from us, with the full intent to keep us from investigating whether Spaldingisms, Dartmouthisms, Kircherisms, or even Rigdonisms could be hidden in the keystone scripture of the Mormon religion? On the Mormonish podcast, Rebecca Biblioteca talked about the inoculation strategy that the church has employed in recent years, which was clearly something that they had been doing all the way back to the 1970s. I talked about how Hugh Nibley and A. Dean Larson started amassing, through BYU's special collections, as much Kircheriana as they could, which they immediately shoved into the vaults, as you can see from these catalog cards, which I requested to be unsealed just a couple of years ago. They show the dates when BYU was collecting these things at very high prices from rare book dealers before the church ever got out of debt, and then locked them away in the vault. Quote, it is remarkable to know that BYU possesses one of the most significant collections of Kircheriana in the country, but it does. The collection, we are told, reflects the university's commitment to research in the 16th and 17th centuries, in which Kircher's works are especially pertinent because they record the conflict between the age of orthodoxy and the emerging age of science. But is that the real reason why the vaults of BYU entomb what now, almost 35 years later, has probably become the largest collection of Kircheriana in the world? Why is it that virtually no Mormon today knows about this trove? I'm not going to repeat all that I had said on Mormonish, but I do want to build on it. As I mentioned in the book, in 1989, BYU put on a very short-lived exhibit dedicated to showcasing the selective works of Athanasius Kircher. Brian Merrill authored and printed this short booklet describing some of the items that were out on display. Of course, in neither the booklet nor the display was there any mention of Barachias Nephi, the obelisk that bears his name, which you can see here on the screen, even though the engraving was in the vault. Why not show that to people? There is no mention of a spiritually magnetic compass, even though many pictures of those were also in the vault. The Reformed Egyptian Prodromus Coptus, not there. The rediscovered messaging of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of the Aztec, never mentioned, or any of the other Kircherisms that I have discussed. However, they did let Vernal Hawley thumb through one of the books, Oedipus Aegyptiacus, and guess what he found? He told Dale Broadhurst about this, who asked some people in his support group for help in figuring out who this Abba Nephi was, which of course means Father Nephi, and help in figuring out why Abba Nephi was mentioned in close association with Enoch, here spelled with an H, and trying to figure out why BYU had never said anything about it to anyone. It is speculation only, but rumor has it that because Hawley found that connection in BYU's exhibit, that might be the reason why the exhibit was so short-lived. So they shut it down. It is a lot of hard work to do primary research. And I hope you can tell from the book that there is a lot that I worked to uncover, and that there is a lot more that we all need to work together to find if we are to assemble and refine what I think is the best sub-theory within the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory of how the Book of Mormon came to pass. So that's where I am right now. And I am happy to turn the time over to you, RFM. If you have any questions or you want to start taking callers.
I do. We are going to take some callers, and I don't want to take a lot of time away from them, but I did want to make one comment right now, which is going to page 245. And this is not so much by way of any kind of challenge, but just for clarity to make sure I understand your theory. Yeah. Chapter 16, the straight path.
Yeah.
So you say, or you write, by definition, a Kircher Nephi theory means that the Nephi in the Book of Mormon was to some degree intentionally modeled on or named after Kircher's Barachias Nephi, as opposed to being a coincidence. So I understand that to mean that your theory, although there's a whole lot to it, and I don't mean to detract from it, but just to simplify it for my personal benefit, is that your theory in large measure hinges on that statement, that these Kircherisms, as you call them, that you identify in the Book of Mormon could only have come from Kircher's materials and not from any other source and not been a coincidence. Is that correct?
If I were in a court of law, I would say that my argument is a preponderance of evidence argument. Nothing hinges on one thing or another thing. As you've read the book, I have a lot of data that I bring to this question from a lot of different disciplines. One of the most interesting things to me that was new are these Kircherisms and the story of Pierre de Monmort and their similarities and their origin story and what they were writing pseudepigrapha. And, some people can say, well, Nephi or Joseph Smith just went to the Bible and the Apocrypha and he just randomly picked names from wherever he wanted for his characters. And he didn't care how they got their names and maybe he did that. And if you like that, and that's your way of seeing your sub-theory within the sole authorship theory, that's fine. That's your prerogative. That's not how writers write, at least not good writers. And the Book of Mormon is interesting and it is complex. And yes, some parts of it are sleepy and seem like chloroform in print. But I go through exhaustively many different kinds of analysis. So I will say no to you. It does not all hinge on one thing.
Okay, then can you explain to me what you meant by writing that, if I'm misunderstanding it? That by definition, a Kircher Nephi theory means that the Nephi in the Book of Mormon was to some degree intentionally modeled on or named after Kircher's Barachias Nephi, as opposed to being a coincidence.
Yeah, so now you just have to let me get to there's a figure that's in the book, and everyone can see it on the website. I could go pick it up from the website, but I'm afraid that I would mess up the technology here. But it's figure 35 in the book, which appears on page 120. I'm going to it now. On the website, if you go to www.howthebookofmormoncametopass.com and scroll down to the figures, I'm making it available to you to see there for free. What I do in the book is I lay out, as I did today, I said there are 3 different theories, and then there are sub-theories beneath those. So I lay out all of the categories, and some of those I give names to, like ones that can accommodate these new Kircherisms and ones that can't. So for example, the ancient authorship theory cannot accommodate Kircherisms. At least I haven't, and I've talked to people. How do you rationalize that this spiritual magnetic compass and Nephi and Mormon and the message of Christianity, all of that stuff is just a coincidence? If it's not just a coincidence, how did it get in the minds of those ancient writers? That's a huge anachronism. It's a new class of anachronism.
Right. And so what you said right there, I think indicates that I'm on the right track, which is your theory is that could not have been a coincidence. If it shows up, what you've identified in the Book of Mormon must have come from Kircher. Am I understanding that correct?
I'm saying that is the most parsimonious explanation of where all of this collection of Kircherisms came from. I don't think it's a coincidence. Someone must have been very educated on Kircher, and as a result, you have to ask yourself who that person might have been. Was it a 22-year-old who had no education, or it was a student at Dartmouth who was under a professor of Oriental languages who was studying Hebrew and Coptic Egyptian? Which seems to be more parsimonious to you?
Right. Ultimately, you come up with Professor John Smith at Dartmouth, the professor of Oriental languages.
And I say in the book, I lay it out that there are different sub theories. One sub theory is that Professor John Smith did give a source text to Solomon Spalding. And another sub theory is that he just taught him this stuff, and he didn't actually give him a source text of any kind. But we have evidence from which I read here in this presentation today that some people who were investigative journalists who looked into this said that he did. And I think it's responsible for me to report that, since no one else has reported it.
Okay. If I tell you what, I don't want to take over the show. I mean,
no, do it. Why not?
Okay. So that's the Cleveland Plain Dealer article that you read. When was that published?
That was late. And that's one of the reasons why I discounted in the book. It was 1874, I think.
Okay. Do you know who wrote it?
I have the article. I didn't memorize his name. Sorry.
Was there a name to it, or was it anonymous? Because I can't remember.
Do you know what? I don't think there was a name. I
thought it was anonymous.
I looked at it and yeah.
It's just, do you know what the basis is for that? Because I mean, what that person wrote is strikingly on point with what you consider to be the most likely theory. Am I right about that?
Like I say, whether there was a source text from Professor Smith or it was just an influence from Professor Smith makes no difference to me. But I tend to take things at face value unless I have a reason to. And people tend to be responsible when they write things in newspapers, but when they are investigative reporters. But someone might have had an agenda. That's always possible, and it was late.
Okay.
So that was the 1887 Cleveland Plain Dealer. Is that correct?
I'll look it up.
I think it was 1874.
Can you read that again? The only reason I say that is because Dan Vogel's in the comments, and he's suggesting that's not about John Smith, but it's instead about Ethan Smith.
Yeah. So Dale Broadhurst addressed this very well on his site. Dan Vogel knows that. If you read it very carefully, it's not possible that Solomon Spalding was under his tuition. Solomon Spalding graduated from Dartmouth in 1785 with a bachelor's degree, and then in 1787 with a master's degree. And Ethan Smith graduated from Dartmouth in 1790 with a bachelor's. So if they did overlap at all, it would have been in the last of the 6 years that Spalding was there, and in the first of the 4 years that Ethan Smith was there. Solomon Spalding never studied under his tuition. So it doesn't make sense to say that Solomon Spalding studied under the tuition of Ethan Smith. And there's more details and more analysis about that. Dale Broadhurst did a great job. I understand I'll call it sole authorship apologetics on dismissing this piece of data that that Dan is pushing, but it has been addressed, and I think Dale Broadhurst is the winner on this one.
I will say that I have an answer at least.
Yeah.
Apparently it's April 24th, 1887. And I'm on page 112.
There you go.
Okay, so there's an answer at least for that.
And
I do my best, but there are some things, some dates and stuff. I like, as long as I get within a few years, you can only put some anyways.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
is that that's our best piece of evidence linking this theory to having John Smith be sort of a middleman?
Not at all.
Read all of
Rick Barron's stuff. There are tons of references in the book. All of Rick Barron's papers. I went to the special collections at the Harold B. Lee Library at BYU, and all of Barron's stuff they just shoved in the vault. I went and got it all, and he's got like hundreds of papers where he talks about the influences of John Smith and how they would have passed down. He talks about whether or not some of those influences could have gotten into the mind of Hiram. He did a thorough job. There by no means is this.
We had Randy Bell on talking about John Smith at Dartmouth, so I'm aware of those connections. I'm speaking specifically about a Spalding. Essentially another Spalding manuscript that makes its way into John's hands that John then hands along to, to Spalding, and then it falls into Rigdon's hands and now comes back to Smith. That idea, is there evidence of that in these articles you're speaking of? Or like, I know the John Smith connection from Dartmouth. I'm aware of that, but I think that overarching general idea that John Smith is at Dartmouth, he's having influence on Hiram, and by relation, then the Smith family is a general point. And then there's the specific point of whatever this missing manuscript is essentially getting back into the hands of Rigdon and then to Smith is kind of a very specific issue. And I'm wondering if there is additional evidence of that in the places that you're talking about.
Well, I have maybe 200-ish pages that were written by Rick Barons that were not published in his papers that are in the special collections. And he actually, before he died, made copies of everything he did, and he sent it to a place in California. And then because I've got my group, there are about 10 of us Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theorists who are trying to really earnestly not because we have an agenda, like why do we have a dog in this fight? We don't. We're just trying to get to the truth. And one of them was given by Rick Barons before he died, all of his stuff. And so that's where I got a lot of the information that led me to go to the special collections of BYU and compare what was in the Barron's file in California versus what was in the Barron's file at BYU. And in that, and I talk about this a lot in the book, I found an email that had been pulled from the Barron's file from BYU, but was in the California backup pile. And it shows that professors from BYU were going to Dartmouth and pulling all the same stuff that I was doing a couple of years before I was there. And they, in these emails, because Rick Barons was collaborating with them, they were so excited they were going to win a Mormon History Association award because they had this hypothesis that Professor John Smith was being called to be an Elias, a preparer and a restorer. He was related to Smith, second cousin twice removed. Maybe there's something patriarchal in the line of Smiths. And that was their hypothesis. And they were chasing it down and they were going to publish it. And then it got kiboshed by their superiors at BYU. And Rick Barons was so upset about that when he said that he was going to put his stuff into the BYU archives as part of his deal, he made copies of everything and sent it to California. So here you have evidence. And I have these emails.
Yeah, there are two sets of his papers. One, BYU, who don't allow access, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one to family members in California to make sure that there was at least a set of his papers that could be accessed by other scholars.
They were not sent to family members. They were sent to other people. I know who those people are, and they are working on it, and they will come out with it when they want to. But I have the emails, and if I need to, I will blot out the names of the BYU professors so that you can't see it. But I'll let you guys see it so you can see their names, and then you can confirm that this was a real project. It did happen. I have evidence from Dartmouth about where they were going, like the type of files they were built. They were, when you pull things from files, you have to sign in for things. So I know who these people are, and they have not published anything about it, and the project got canceled. Why? Well, Rick Barron said that it was because they couldn't make stick an argument from patriarchy when Professor John Smith and Joseph Smith were not as closely related as they thought they would be. And Rick Barron provides a pedigree of how they are truly related to each other in the exhibit of one of his papers.
And this is because they've saddled themselves with this idea that they have to interpret this in a faithful manner.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. How can you make sense of how John Smith was involved? And you look at the lectures that he has, and there are only 13 of the thousands that they had. What happened to all of them? I'm not suggesting that the Mormon Church, got rid of them or something, but maybe they did. They've done things like that in the past, haven't they? But of the lectures that survive, he goes deep on Isaiah. He quotes from Isaiah, but everybody was quoting from Isaiah. So,
Yeah. So, Bill, do we have any people who are on the line?
Oh, you're not coming through, Bill. You're mute.
Yeah, I don't know. I've got 3 callers in the call bank, so let me grab the first one here. Give me just a second. So let's see how this goes. The first one, I don't have any information. Caller, what's the name?
Clark Abood.
Clark, how are you?
I'm doing good.
Good.
I just wanted to express my appreciation for his research, and I agree that the Mormon historians are lazy learners, and we need some people to look into all this.
Yeah, appreciate it, my friend.
Well, having read the book,
I just had one question.
Lars is not a lazy learner. Clark, are you going on? Do you have a question or comment? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just had one question. So he brought up John Smith. I was curious about his thoughts on, because the old Book of Commandments, section 10, verse 10 says that Hiram translated the golden plates as well. Does he believe that maybe that's the connection with Hiram and John Smith, of Hiram's involvement with the Book of Mormon and all that?
I personally don't think so. I don't think there's enough evidence to put that to rest either way. What I do know is that Joseph Smith did things to try to put his family members and others into positions of respect and power. It may have been that he intimated that Hiram had some ability. He intimated that his father had some ability. It may have been that he exaggerated some of his father's dreams. Or we all know that there is sometimes some Lucy Mack Smith, I think, in her biographical sketches, kind of went back and did some revisionist history and made her sons a little bit more patriarchal, a little bit more reverent than they were. This happens. It's possible that happened to Hiram in that particular instance, but that's not the focus of my research. But it's a good question.
Yeah. So one of the folks is asking if we could sort of recap the theory, and I'm going to try to steel man it.
Oh, good.
Kircher, from long time ago, has a ton of influence on his day, but he's sort of exposed as a fraud.
Yeah.
John Smith at Dartmouth takes a deep interest in him, writes a manuscript, but is afraid that doing something with it will hurt his reputation. So he passes it along to Spalding. Spalding puts it in the Pittsburgh print shop. Rigdon then gets it from there, then gets connected with Joseph Smith. And between the two of them, collaborate. Joseph Smith then using that as the basis for his translation of the gold plates.
I would add one more step to that, Bill, and you correct me or don't correct me, Lars, which is that after getting the outline from Professor John Smith, or being talked about it by Professor John Smith, Solomon Spalding then writes his own story incorporating those ideas or that outline. So it's actually Solomon Spalding's manuscript that ends up being found, but incorporating those ideas of Kircher via John Smith, that ends up in Sidney Rigdon's possession, and then through him to Joseph Smith. Sidney Rigdon adds his own stuff, which is mostly theological, including, excoriating people who think that infants need to be baptized in Mormon chapter 8, which appears to have been a big thing for Sidney Rigdon as well. In fact, maintaining that position made him lose his job as a pastor, I believe.
The rest, the first Baptist minister, in Pittsburgh, First Baptist
And
Church.
so, and then he passes on to Joseph Smith for reasons that Lars has already talked about. He sketched out, really. It's more fully set forth in the book. And then Joseph Smith ends up adding a few things of his own too.
But minor in comparison, very minor in comparison.
So in the Book of Mormon, you then have Solomon Spalding's manuscript, essentially, but containing the Kircherisms given to him by means of Professor John Smith, with Sidney Rigdon's theological additions added to it, and then a few minor things put in by Joseph Smith toward the end of the production process.
Yeah.
Now, is that right, Lars?
To the best of my ability, I would say that 45% of the Book of Mormon are the original words or the massaged words, especially with the rewriting of the 116 pages. I deal with that very well in the book. And are the words of Solomon Spalding. About 50% of it's Rigdon, about 5% of it's Joseph Smith. Based on a lot of different tools, not just common word frequency analysis. That's kind of where I come up. And I didn't publish that number in the book because it's very quantified, and why do that? But that's my feeling about it. I do want to correct one thing about what you had said, Bill. You characterized it as a collaborative effort or collaboration between Rigdon and Smith. I don't think that it needs to be that. I think that when Joseph Smith said to Rigdon, I've seen the plates, I found the plates, I have the plates, I'm ready to go, then I think Sidney Rigdon gives him, sends to him, they meet, however it is, it doesn't really matter. But because how are you going to find evidence for these things? Oh, I saw someone who had a hat that maybe it was Sidney Rigdon and maybe it was Josiah Stoll. We're wasting our time. That's not the analysis that needs to be done here. But I think that Sidney Rigdon, all he has to do is send the manuscript in one shipment. As soon as the canal is open, sends Parley P. Pratt back to Palmyra, hands it off to Smith. Smith starts to transcribe it in April, right, in the spring. Then he loses the pages, and now he's stuck. He doesn't know what to do. Rigdon is the one who solves the problem. And then over the next winter, after he's all done, he sends the pages with Parley P. Pratt. Smith then, in rapid fire, 60 days, churns it all out. There's no collaboration between Rigdon and Smith. There doesn't need to be. They don't need to meet 10 times and be in secret places and knowing that they're doing some villainous conspiracy. All of that's a silly version, in my opinion, of a sub theory of the Spalding-Rigdon-Smith theory that is conspiratorial, which we need to just abandon at this point.
Maybe a better word is needed, but what I was trying to convey is that not only is Rigdon taking the material and putting in some ideas, but obviously Joseph Smith is also having to contribute some ideas so that it's collaborative in the sense that there is material in the Book of Mormon from both of them.
Yeah. I think everyone who's looked at this would agree with that. There are things in the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith clearly added. There are things that appear so ancient that Joseph Smith couldn't have added them. Yes, this is how I look at it. 45%, 50%, 5%. Best way to think about it.
Yeah, one of the things about the Book of Mormon that's strange to me, which has been more and more revealed as more and more research has been done, is its relationship to the Bible. Mm-hmm. And it's so much more than just quoting almost verbatim vast passages of Isaiah and the Sermon on the Mount and references to Paul's epistles, but it is throughout, and little tiny words and phrases here and there. I think we're at the point where it's indisputable that whoever wrote the Book of Mormon knew the Bible inside and out, backward and forward. Mm-hmm. And these expressions just came to mind because they were so familiar mm-hmm. with the material. And the question then becomes, was that Joseph Smith? Was he the one who knew the Bible backward and forward so much that he could have dictated the book or even written the Book of Mormon? And one other thing that I want to bring up, and this is on page 314 of your book, because I think this is something that has occurred to me before, Lars, and it goes along the same lines, excuse me. Where you say at the bottom, now pay attention now, there's going to be a quiz at the end of this.
Okay, I'm looking at it.
Unfortunately, ever since Brody, whenever a researcher might have identified a potential influence on the composition of the Book of Mormon, sole authorship enthusiasts rushed to aggrandize their overall profile for Joseph Smith. that he must have been more widely read and educated than anyone had previously thought.
Yep, there's the circular logic. The only evidence that they put forth to say that he was so educated was the content of the Book of Mormon. That's it. There's
Well, right.
there's no triangulation beyond that.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this for some time now and thinking, well, if this is all true, then are we creating a polymath in Joseph Smith that's equally as hard to believe as that he talked with angels and God?
That's right.
All this came from somewhere, and somebody wrote it, and somebody who did it had a lot of knowledge that it's hard to square with what we know about Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me, by the way, on the way back from London recently, I had a chance to watch a movie I'd never seen before, although it's famous. It's called Good Will Hunting. Have you seen that?
Love it.
Okay. I thought it was okay. But, Matt Damon is the guy who's smarter than everybody, and he's a total dick.
Yes.
But anyway, he's smarter than everybody, right? And he knows all these books where he can argue with people and give the page number on the book, all these different books. And that's just about American history, right? Mm-hmm. And he knows everything about everything. And he's just so freaking smart. It's amazing. You never see him with a book.
Yeah.
He doesn't even read. Mm-hmm. All the time, he's either working at, difficult labor jobs, or he's hanging out with his buddies down at the bar and getting into fights.
Never
and you look at it and say, okay, so how does this guy know any of this? Even if he's super smart, you got to read something once in a while if you're going to be able to quote things from books and say what pages they're on. And sometimes I look at Joseph Smith and I think, he's like Matt Damon in Good Will Hunting. He's the guy who knows everything, but he's never picked up a book in his life. And it seemed like a plot hole to me in the movie. And in some ways, it seems like a plot hole to me in the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith dictating it or creating it.
In the sole authorship theory. It's a major gap. Let me address some of the points that you made earlier. Yes, if you read what like Stanford Carmack has written about this, or Royal Skousen, but I really like focusing on some of the Stanford Carmack stuff. He talks about phraseologies where you have interesting constructions like the conjunctive or the subjunctive that, or because that. So for example, I believe in something because my ancestors did. If in about 100 years before Joseph Smith, in the generation leading up to Solomon Spalding, they would have said, I believe something because that my ancestors believed them, instead of saying because without the that, right? So that's a construction that appears in the Book of Mormon kind of oddly, because it's not really related. There are some instances to, I don't want to like overgeneralize everything that Stanford Carmack has done, but if you can go and read all of his constructions where he says, this is interesting. This tells me that Joseph Smith must have really understood literature from like 100 or 200 years before he was born. And how did he know about like the subjunctive in Greek versus it's all totally understandable when you realize that Solomon Spalding was doing it. And I have in the book, actually, a case of this on page 148. I include the letter that Solomon Spalding wrote when he came out as an atheist. And I'll just read right here, this couple sentences. In giving you my sentiments of the Christian religion, you will perceive that I am not trammeled, that I do not believe certain facts and certain propositions to be true, merely because that my ancestors believed them and because they are popular. Right. So he's using the construction that is the same construction that Stanford Carmack is arguing is proof that Joseph Smith must have been some crazy literary genius channeling writers from a couple hundred years before he was born. We can just stop with all the craziness. The sole authorship theory doesn't hold water. It's not parsimonious. It makes you reject tons of data that that's not academically responsible to reject. And if you make Rigdon pious and Smith a pious fraud, then everything falls into place. Nothing is difficult, and you don't have to throw away any data. And there are no contradictions.
Yeah, and just to say in favor of what you guys are saying, some folks would point to, for instance, the vision of the tree of life that Joseph Smith Sr. has, or the similarity that the family of Lehi, the children, have to Joseph Smith's brothers. But folks have to always keep in mind that the 116 pages that were lost were the original edition of whatever the master plan was. They're gone. Now Smith is, again, deeply frustrated at the loss of those 116 pages. From a secular perspective, something about the plan was thwarted, and he felt a lot of frustration over that. In order to deal with it, he translates the rest of the Book of Mormon, which would have been, again, the original plan. And I'm not arguing that there aren't parts of Joseph Smith in the rest of the book, but it seems like when we point to pieces of Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, we are most often focusing on the beginning of the Book of Mormon. And it's because he finishes the project and then comes back and has to create a filler that matches what the end of the project was, stays aligned to some degree with the lost 116 pages, but he can't reproduce the data. RFM has covered this recently in an episode of Radio Free Mormon, actually a couple of them, pointing out sort of some of these contradictions. But the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, Nephi to, essentially when those small plates of Nephi are left off, those have to be dealt with as a separate thing than the rest of the Book of Mormon.
So I think that I all of your points, first of all, I object to the use of the word master plan. That makes it sound like a conspiracy. We've been using those words. We need to stop using those words, because but I think that Rigdon, had Spalding's text, had his visions, added up, made it into a elaborate document, felt justified that he was receiving visions and adding to it. In some ways, like unto how Matthew is an expansive retelling of Mark. Someone had the Mark source and then basically took that and then just added a few more things, a few more stories, maybe a vision or two, right? And then, but where did Mark come from? Maybe from, and we can talk about those sources. But this is kind of the way that scripture sometimes happens, is that people get something in their hands and then they do an expansive retelling on it, adding things of their own volition. I think that's what Rigdon was doing. How he justified it in his mind, whether he was high, I think he probably was some of the time, probably because of his nerves and his injuries and the fumes. And excuse me. And Sidney Rigdon composed something, sent it off to Joseph Smith. He messed up with Martin Harris, lost the pages, didn't have a good plan. It's possible that Sidney Rigdon fixed the 116 pages, and then the next year sent all of that to Joseph Smith, and he rapid fire just went through it and made a few additions and changes along the way, because that was always his prerogative in his mind. Now, the subtleties of whether Rigdon did what work on the 116 pages versus what Smith would have done in the revision of the 116 pages, I provide a new type of analysis on that point, and it starts with this figure, Bill. You can't see it. If I go this way, you can see it. So it's the wherefore, therefore analysis that was the basis for Brent Metcalf's Mosiah prioritization theory. And of course, he did a great job with that, and it's true, and everyone accepts it. But I take that analysis a level deeper that he never did, based on this Spalding-Rigdon theory. And there are subtleties in the wherefore, therefore pattern that are perfectly explained now, that weren't explained and haven't been explained under sole authorship theory. And so I'd invite you to read that chapter, because I think it addresses this. It's a very fun point in the rewriting of the 116 pages. Who did the mind share of the work? Based on my analysis, Rigdon did substantially all of it. And then Smith took that new thing and changed like 5 or 6 parts. And those parts were significant and they're glaring, and you found them. Of course you found them.
Who's next on the line, Bill?
Yep, let's grab that. I think it's a person by the name of Marshall. Marshall, are you there? Hello?
I'm here.
Yep, go ahead. You're on
Hi,
Mormonism Live.
Marsan.
Marsan, gotcha. Go ahead.
I have the same question again. I mean, I think maybe Lars answered it, but with the Spalding-Rigdon theory, I always want to know, well, how did Rigdon get his book to Joseph Smith before Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, if the Book of Mormon was written before Sidney Rigdon met Joseph Smith? I guess he said Parley Pratt took it to him. Is that the addition to the theory that I've missed here?
Yeah, we know that Parley P. Pratt had lived in Palmyra in 1825 with his uncles Ira and Alan Pratt. And then he moved to Ohio. And we have there's a lot that you can piece out from the autobiography. You know, he said that he lived in a hut with a bed of leaves and straw and drank water from the river and had fat venison and stole some bread from the settlements. Like we have his account. We know when he went to Ohio, and he became an assistant to Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon confides in Parley P. Pratt that he needs some help in finding the Cave of Wonders that contains these golden artifacts so that he can have more scripture to restore. And Parley P. Pratt intimates that there's a guy from Palmyra that says he has this ability. And so he says, well, let's pray about it. Let's see if we want to do it. And then he sends Parley P. Pratt to talk to Joseph Smith about this opportunity. Very straightforward, very easy. You don't have to create some weird logistical nightmare to figure out who was where, when, and in what city, you know, who was hiding. You don't have to do any of that.
Because the 116 pages are lost,
Mm-hmm.
and sorry, if you're wondering about the phone call like that, I ended the phone call like,
oh, sorry,
in the answer. So I thought you addressed her question, and
Thanks for calling, Marzipan.
Sorry. So the 116 pages are lost. Smith doesn't want to try to reproduce them. It seems apparent
he's not smart enough to reproduce them, and
well,
maybe
where's the document at? The document should exists. Smith would have it. Why can't he reproduce them?
Well, I talk about this also in the book. A number of things are possible. One is he may have burned whatever he got from Rigdon because he would want to destroy the evidence as he longed, right? Mm-hmm. Because now you don't have anything that could incriminate you. Mm-hmm. So that's a possibility. It's also a possibility that he didn't, but he knew that he had riffed on a few things because maybe why not? Enough as he went along that and his memorization when he did memorize, I think some of the time behind the curtain, he might have just been reading, so he wouldn't have to memorize as much, but sometimes being so convincing in his performative recitation off to the sides of the curtain so that Martin Harris would really believe that he's, you know, having a real experience here. Be that as it may, I think that that Joseph Smith might have realized, I can't reproduce this exactly, and then I'm going to be exposed. So we need a different solution, and he wasn't smart enough to come up with another solution. So Sidney Rigdon came up with a solution, and then he just sends him the new manuscript the next spring, like he did the reading before. He gets it, and then boom, he's off to translate, and he's not messing around this time. He's getting it done. 7 pages a day, got a new scribe, doing some performative recitations on them and the Whitmers to make everyone like believe in who he is, because he is a pious fraud. He's not fully pious.
Right. Okay. Next caller here looks like it's Simona. And sorry, the last caller was Marzipan.
Hello.
Is that the name, Simona?
Yes.
Okay, Simona, you're on Mormonism Live.
Okay, I want to make a comment because I think maybe I never heard that you guys talk about them. Perhaps another reason why the Book of Mormon, it seems that even though Joseph Smith claimed that he wrote it, and Joseph Smith, being a treasure hunter, he probably learned he read books. I really believe that he could read very well, because even though he didn't have much education, I know people that they actually, because they love to read, they master the language very well, and they love to seek knowledge. And in this case, Joseph, he was a treasure hunter, so I'm pretty sure that probably he read about the treasures that came from the 3 famous cultures, the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas. You know, then they supposedly hid treasures, and especially because the Inca Empire, if you read about it, and they have legends that explain about where they came from. And there are 2 legends there, or 2 stories. For one is similar to the idea of Lehi and his wife, you know, leaving certain place to come to supposedly Peru to God send them to train the people that were living like savages, which in this case will be maybe like what happened to the Jedi guys, okay? And so they came and they taught them all this, what you know now today, than those remains in our, the buildings and everything that remains of the Inca Empire. And also they have another story of Manco Cápac and his brothers. Manco Cápac, in this case, will be Nephi, and has his brothers. But Manco Cápac was supposed to be the wise son, the good son, that actually the gods chose him to be the one who will build the Inca Empire. So there are those two stories there. Now, all the stories that we know about the Inca history, we know from Garcilaso de la Vega, who was a famous writer in his time.
Simona, can I just interject here? Time out,
yes.
Simona. Hang on a second. Okay.
Yes.
You raised some wonderful issues, some wonderful points. I'm just not sure that they're directly on what we're talking about tonight. And I know we've got a lot of people who are piled up on the phone. Did you have a question that you were leading up to for Lars?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, what I'm trying to tell you is I think Spalding, like you say, he had probably a good, understanding of the scriptures, but also he also was studying and learning about the origin of the native people in Central America.
Well, in North America, Spalding was a missionary among the.
No, and North America too, because if you know about the Peruvian culture, they think that the Incas, it went clear all the way to North America because they used to conquer. They conquered a lot of land, a lot of territories. But so I think that all those stories, and you guys have one episode actually that didn't confirm what I'm thinking, because you have one about Smith that he played. He had a play done called Pizarro. I don't know if you remember about talking about it, and even Brigham Young was one of the actors. And Pizarro is actually the name of the conqueror from Peru. So I think that you guys probably need to do more towards that side than why probably the Book of Mormon is written, and that's why it's so appealing to the people in Latin America. That's why they become converts, because they think, oh wow, this is so similar to our stories, and why even the church in the past had been used the Peruvian structures just to tell them, oh yeah, that's what the Book of Mormon was written about it. But when I researched also myself about it, the reason why we can say that the story of Lamanites and Nephites has to do with
Simona,
well, there is so much I could tell you.
Yes.
I love you dearly, but you're killing me, Smalls.
Yeah.
So I think that what you're suggesting is that perhaps Solomon Spalding might have gotten some information about the Book of Mormon from his knowledge or studies about the empires in the South and these different legends that came about from it. I'm going to have to cut you off here. I really appreciate your calling, and maybe another time we'll talk about those things, because I think they're very, very interesting.
I will just say, yes, Solomon Spalding was very intelligent. He lived among Native Americans as a missionary in tribes for 10 years. He learned their ways and customs and their differences. He would have found out a lot of nuance, and that would have allowed him to have more to draw upon in writing all of the fun things that we all enjoy in certain parts, the plot heavy parts of the Book of Mormon. Yeah.
So thanks so much, Simona, for calling. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. We're going to have to go to the next call, though.
And there aren't any more callers in the call bank. So
no way. Are you kidding me? There's at least 2 people who I thought would be calling, and they better call right now, or I'm never going to be talking to them again. And I think you know who you are, both of you. So hopefully they'll be coming up with something here in a second. I may have prematurely ditched Simona, but I don't think so. So, Dan Vogel says he's not going to call. Okay. Oh, what? Well, then there's still one other person out there. Let me see if there's anything else that I can bring up here.
I will say this. I think this theory is it's worthy of the research. It's worthy of the book being written. I don't know that I agree per se.
Well, you have to read it.
No, total. But I did spend time, again, not only just talking to RFM, but also exploring the documents on the website. I listened to the conversation on Mormonish. I'm aware of the general points that need to happen for this theory to work. There are so many things that go on in Mormonism that are worthy of writing, and this is certainly one of them. And as RFM said, I think the book's well written, tons of research in it. I think this is an issue that's worth exploring. There's so many things in Mormonism tied to the Book of Mormon authorship that I think are deeply interesting. And we covered the Spalding theory a month or so ago, spent some time on it. And I think this is a fascinating way to sort of, if there were things about that theory you didn't like, there's things about this one that sort of solve some of that.
Yeah, I went through those 3 episodes very carefully and made a list of every single thing where someone's like, but this doesn't make sense. And now you have to, every point, if you go them point by point, and after reading my book, you will see they are all resolved. And I just did this again earlier this week, just to be prepared for today. And I think that you'll enjoy that experience. Once you're done with the book, go back and do those 3 episodes and be like, taken care of, every single one. So, and of course, if someone has any criticisms, send them my way, because I'm imperfect. We're all learning. We're doing this together. But I think it's time to really move the camp back to where it was for the first 100 years of the church. And to stop making Joseph Smith into things by making unchecked assumptions that we're not realizing we're making, that are actually circular.
It is interesting that on the faithful side, Joseph Smith is the closest thing to a dunce you could have for their polemical purposes.
Yes.
And yet on the other side, he's brilliant.
Yeah.
He's Matt Damon.
It's not right. But the real reason you guys aren't going to like, some people aren't going to like this, but some people sell a lot of books by making a lot of nuance where there isn't any. And it's book after book, and it's new history this and new history that, because as long as in that space, there's more mystery and intrigue, and we're not actually solving the problem, then they get to keep talking about it. They get to keep being experts on it. And all the non-Mormons and Mormons are like, I need to learn more, and it's still confusing. Maybe someone else can give me some insights. We don't need to do that anymore. Like, I think that this is a much clearer way of looking at all of it. Like I said, if you have any data that you really think shoots it down, send it my way, and we'll iterate.
You feel like you've solved this, that you are the Mormon or post-Mormon Oedipus who has solved this riddle of the Sphinx.
Oh, there you go. I'm Athanasius Kircher. I'm just making up my sources so I can sell a lot of books.
Oh, no. I didn't mean that reference. I just meant the Oedipal reference.
No, like, I don't think I've solved the riddle of the Sphinx. I think that what I'm doing is putting the ball back into the right court. And then once we're there, we'll figure out the details. I do think that a Spalding, a pious Rigdon, and a pious fraud Smith, what I'm calling the straight path, the K5P in the book, but I call it K5P version 1.0 because I'm admitting that it's going to need to improve. No new theory is ever right on the nose, right on the beam every time from the get-go. Of course not. And I'm excited to see how this will evolve. But the ball is back in the right court now, like it was from the beginning, and we can go from there.
Okay. So nobody else on the phone, right, Bill?
You're on.
I'm taking. No, we do have another caller or two now. If you want to talk to them.
Can we do that? We've got like 7 more minutes. So if we can avoid any lengthy calls and just have a question or two.
Who knows who? Yeah, who knows who will be lengthy and who won't?
I'll get my crucifix ready.
John, is that the name?
It is. Yes.
Right,
hello.
You're on Mormonism Live, my friend.
Thank you so much. I have a question, and it's very simple. Are there any novel ideas in the Book of Mormon that you don't see in the writings of Spalding or Kircher or Smith, the older Smith? And if so, what are those?
Novel ideas in the Book of Mormon that I wasn't able to see could be mapped to specific influences. You know what I think would be helpful to you?
Or including influences from the the King James version of the Bible.
And also, you
are there any novel ideas that aren't?
And you're not talking like the sermons of Joseph Smith's milieu, or you're looking for something that is uniquely not available to Joseph Smith.
Is it uniquely not
Yes.
available or just uniquely not mentioned by Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Solomon Spalding, or John Smith?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a fair question. I like it. What I would say is when I started this, I'm a mechanistic organic chemist. So what I do is I lay out all of the theories about how molecules interact with each other, at what speeds, at what angles, what orbitals are involved, when electrons get transferred. You lay out all of the different mechanisms, and then you kind of categorize all of the data that then speaks to these mechanisms, and you try to steelman each one of those mechanisms and then find ways of distinguishing through experimentation between the mechanisms. And that is philosophically at the core of this project. I said to myself, are there any details in the Book of Mormon that could not have been put there by Joseph Smith, full stop? And so I went through and I verse by verse, and I had all these thoughts, and I said, well, what if the proper nouns Nephi and Mormon meant something? So I went chasing that down to see if there was anything there. And it was maybe about a year and a half later that I ran into this Pierre de Monmore thing and realized, oh, that's a Jesuit priest. And he's a professor of Oriental languages. Maybe that has something to do with it. And then I ran into Nephi and realized that was another Jesuit priest who was a professor of Oriental languages from the same decade, who was making up sources, pseudepigrapha, and then getting ousted from the Jesuit order or being ridiculed publicly for what he was doing. And then I was like, well, now I've got to do a deep dive on Kircher. And then it doesn't take long before you find these spiritually magnetic compasses and yada, yada, yada. And so that is part, I love the way you're thinking, caller. I forget your name. I apologize. But that is what one must do to distinguish between the theories, because now we have something that Joseph Smith couldn't have put in the Book of Mormon. Now, I invite everyone out there to try to find a way that Joseph Smith could have become a world expert on Kircher. I've got lots of emails from people saying, but there is this one PDF and it mentions Kircher and it's from 1813 or something. And it might have been in Joseph Smith's area. And of course, all right, I've gone through most of this. You pull up the PDF and you read it through, and it mentions Kircher one or two times, says nothing about Nephi, says nothing about the spiritual magnetic compasses. Kircher was essentially, he wasn't highly talked about, and the details of his life, you could not know from the sources that people have sent to me saying, oh, I found Kircher it mentioned in an article or something. Well, first of all, it's not likely that Joseph Smith had access to those things. It's not likely he studied them deeply. And there is no way that he got into the real meat and the details. Nephi, spiritual magnetic compasses, Reformation message of Christianity among the Aztecs and the Mayans, all of that. But I challenge people to do that because, again, I don't have a dog in this fight. If you prove to me that these are the books that mention all of these Kircherisms, and Joseph Smith had access to those things, great. You just shot down to a significant extent. I think you've got a lot more work to do, but you just made a significant case for going back to the sole authorship theory. Good luck. I did that. I tried as hard as I could. I invite you to try.
Thanks, John, for calling in. And we've got another caller. Is that right, Bill?
You're on mute again.
No. Yeah, you don't have to say that. I'll see it and I'll fix it. I'm just trying to grab it. No biggie.
I hate it when people say that to me.
Yeah, I know. Eventually we have to, but give me a second. I'll solve it. All right. So looks like Cheryl. Cheryl, you're on the line. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead. You're on Mormonism.
Okay, this is great. I have a question, perhaps once again, because I came in a little bit, maybe 15 minutes into it, but I want to verify, was Kircher a theologian that John Smith taught at Dartmouth? So John Smith was a professor at Dartmouth, correct, of theology and
Yes.
languages and so forth? And was Kircher, along with Emanuel Swedenborg, we learned from Randall Bell, gosh, it's been a while ago, that Randall Bell was on Mormonism Live, and we learned so much about Hiram, learning so much there, and then consequently he would bring stuff to Joseph and teach things to Joseph as well from John Smith, who was their relative.
Right. That's
right.
That's the theory. That's the theory. Yes.
Okay, so Kircher was another theologist that John Smith taught about. Is that correct?
So yes, Kircher was a professor of Oriental languages. He was the most famous of all professors of Oriental languages. I cite in the book several places where over the next 100 years, Edward Stillingfleet, John Jackson would quote Kircher and even his Abba Nephi as a fictitious source worthy of ridicule. So in some ways, the words Nephi and Mormon, and also Thomas Boyes, an article that I found that was digitized only a little bit ago that has never been discussed in any Mormon forum ever, about where the word Mormon came from and how it was used as a pejorative and as a synonym for a pun, because of this very long thing that was happening in French. So professors of Oriental languages for the next 100 years after Kircher died were talking about Kircher's made-up sources, Abba Nephi. Another one is actually Jalaldinus. That's another made-up source. It's another backstory we don't have time for that Kircher made up during his life. And so Nephi and Mormon are like jargon. They're key words that in the field of linguistics, everybody would know because they're the people who made up the most famous sources that were pseudoepigraphic and false.
Lars,
He called them false and fabulous is what he called them.
To follow up on Cheryl's question, is there any evidence that you've uncovered that Professor John Smith either had a copy of any book or by Kircher or referred to him in any of his writings or notes that you found?
Yeah, so I even have a figure in the book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. You'll find it. It's on the website. This was something I was hunting down. Do we have any evidence that that Professor John Smith or someone at Dartmouth had some works of Kircher? Now we know that Professor John Smith was a rare book dealer. He operated out of his own home, I mentioned, and so he would have been trafficking in lots of rare books. But one of the collections of rare books at Dartmouth College burned down, and the provenance for those books also went up in those flames. And so we don't have a lot of information about that. But I went digging and found in a census of books, and I talk about this in the book, that there was a copy of Oedipus Aegyptiacus at Dartmouth University. Dartmouth College. I made that mistake once before. I will never make that again. It's Dartmouth College, not Dartmouth University, even though it is a university today. That is not its name. I've gotten actually a lot of comments on that. And it's clear that a copy of Oedipus Aegyptiacus was at Dartmouth College, and it was in the inventory of another library that it was listed as one of the most precious artifacts that were in the Dartmouth Library before it got lost/burned. There is a copy of Oedipus Aegyptiacus at Dartmouth College right now that they unpackaged for the first time in 1983. And the plate for that is Foreign English and Bookseller, which was no earlier than 1795. So if that was the same copy of Oedipus Aegyptiacus that Professor John Smith had, then he would have bought that copy no earlier than 1795. That's what we know right now.
And I put up on the screen, this I think is the image you're talking about.
Oh, you found it. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was 36. I thought it was 36. So there's the proof right there, that they did have Oedipus Aegyptiacus at Dartmouth College. They lost it / lost track of it. And then, and I actually was speaking to one of the curators there, and I said, look, I found proof that you guys had Oedipus Aegyptiacus. They were ecstatic. They had no idea, because this is the first example that they had proof that they had that book before they knew that they had the book. You find lots of stuff if you're digging. I think that John Smith probably gave or bequeathed or whatever most of his books to Masonic libraries. And so one of the things that I would like to do if I had a second life and bigger pocketbook is to go to those libraries where I think he has some of his books and see if I can find some marginalia in the size of the pages, or maybe something that's stuffed in between the leaves. how awesome would it be if, you saw him circle the word Liahona in a dictionary or something, right? Or write it into the margins or something. There's a lot that we could look for, and I think people should. I did, and I found things that have never been found before. I think anybody could if they wanted to.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer, Cheryl. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Is that take care of everybody else who's on the line, Bill?
There's one other person who's been on the line 8 minutes.
Well, it better be Randy. So let's go ahead and see who it is.
All right. So, caller, what's the name?
Shane.
Shane, how are you?
Doing good. Glad to talk to all three of you.
Glad to have you on.
My question, I have 2 questions. First question with Lars. According to your theory, I haven't read all the books, so sorry. But according to your theory, when the 116 pages crisis happened, you would probably say that if Rigdon was the one who was helping to rewrite it, then in 2 Nephi 3, which is that supposed prophecy concerning Joseph Smith and the spokesman, which I believe is referring to Sidney Rigdon. Do you identify that as Sidney Rigdon as well?
I don't identify it in the book, but I like that. I think that Sidney Rigdon made himself to be, he kind of in reference to Exodus, where Aaron is supposed to be the spokesperson for Moses. I think that Sidney Rigdon set himself up similar, that he was the prophet and Joseph Smith was the spokesperson. That was the dynamic that he liked. And I think Smith saw that and didn't like it and reversed it in that verse.
And also reversed it later on in Mosiah when he's talking about a seer is greater than a prophet.
Exactly. So these are examples of little tiny things that Joseph Smith changed because he's like, no, I'm in charge here. Or he wanted to assert himself and he wanted to ingratiate himself into the book. And so there's some of the things that he did. I think that the prophecy where Jacob, the younger son of Nephi, Joseph, the younger son of Nephi, prophesies. Oh gosh. Was it Jacob or Joseph?
Joseph in 3.
It's gonna be Joseph.
Son of Joseph.
Right, but Joseph then prophesies that Joseph of Egypt had prophesied that there would be a Joseph in the future whose father's name would also be Joseph. I think that's Joseph Smith adding that at that point. But most sole authorship theorists make this fallacy, which is called the composition division fallacy, where some property of a part is misconstrued to be a property of the whole. Yes, there are a few points where Joseph Smith puts some things in and changes them, and that is a property of that part, but is not the property of the whole. Don't make that mistake. It's a fallacy.
Well, I will tell you something that, thank you, Shane, for calling in. Oh, you said you had a second question, Shane? Did you hang up on
Bill hung up on accident. So.
I forgot that. Yeah, I hung up. Sorry about that. I forgot he had a second question. So I'm super sorry, Shane.
Well, let me make this observation, which everybody agrees on, I think. And it's a strange situation that Joseph Smith produces the Book of Mormon. He's seen God and or Jesus Christ, or at least an angel or something. And he's produced this whole book, for crying out loud. He's dictated into being. And for some reason, after starting his church, Sidney Rigdon shows up, and Joseph Smith immediately allows Sidney Rigdon to take charge in dictating what the theology should be.
The very first Sunday after they meet for the first time, which may have been the first time that they physically met in person, that's not a problem, right? We don't require a collaboration where they've met multiple times. That's not necessary here. So it may be truthful that was the first time that he saw it. And it may be true that Sidney Rigdon, when he said that was the first time that someone put the Book of Mormon in my hands in that form, that might've been true because it wasn't in book form before, right? And a lot of these, recollections are late and they might be a little bit massaged because it's too hard to explain to people the truth about what exactly happened and why do that. Smith might have even instructed people, like he did to many others, that talking about this, you would get destroyed because it's too sacred or whatever. It's very easy to imagine that Joseph Smith was like, don't talk about this.
Right. Well, here you got Joseph Smith. I mean, look, I know that the traditional theory is, here comes Sidney Rigdon. He's a big-time pastor. He knows the Bible. Joseph Smith doesn't know the Bible because this is the ignorant Joseph Smith theory. And he comes in, and even after having the experience of trusting Martin Harris and the 116 pages and learning that he needs to not trust other people, but trust in God, now he's going to be trusting in Sidney Rigdon, some kind of has-been or fired Campbellite minister, to start influencing the doctrine of this church. And that got early members of the church very concerned, and some of them ended up leaving the church over it. David Whitmer, I think, talked about this later in life and how concerned he was, and he didn't understand how that would be. So either, I'm not going to say either or, but the two theories on the table right now are Joseph Smith just kowtowed to Sidney Rigdon because he saw him as having so much more experience and so much more familiarity with the Bible, because he hadn't gotten the sea legs as a prophet yet, I guess, or there's some relationship that maybe they have to where he looks up to him already, perhaps before he even arrives on the scene, according to the historical record, as a guy that he needs to look to for theological guidance.
Yeah. I think that a better way of looking at it is not that Sidney Rigdon joined Smith's church. It's that Sidney Rigdon allowed Smith to create his own branch of his church. And then when Joseph Smith was flailing at that and wasn't very administrative, he didn't really get much of a following. After 6 or 7 months of trying to push the Book of Mormon, he only had like 65 converts in total among 3 different branches at Palmyra/Manchester and Fayette and Colesville. People were not flocking to this new religion. They were not inspired by Joseph Smith. But what happened is that, and Sidney Rigdon, probably in December, this is maybe one of the reasons why he went out there, was like, what's going on? It's not working. I thought that maybe the people would just flock to this. And he's like, look, we need to merge because you're not doing this on your own. And 20 to 30 people from Smith's congregations end up joining with Rigdon's congregations, which were substantially larger. He had a lot more projects going on with the Isaac Morley Farm. He had congregations in Kirtland and other places in Geauga County. It was not a merger of equals. Rigdon was far more capable and established. He knew how to lead, and Joseph Smith knew how to enchant, but and he was bewitching and iconic, but he was not. He needed to grow into being a prophet, and that could not happen unless he was able to observe Rigdon more closely. They merged. It wasn't a merger of equals, but in time, because Smith was the one who had brought the plates out of the ground, as everybody had said, and as he had made his witnesses evangelize to other people, everyone believed him to have the greater gift. And so over time, he naturally usurped some of the power from Rigdon, and eventually took enough of the power from Rigdon that he was calling the shows and strutting around like a general on the streets of Nauvoo. I definitely think that Joseph Smith's church would have become as burnt over as all the others in that area of New York if it had not been for his merger with Rigdon's church. And I will also say that later on in life, most Mormons will will tell that Sidney Rigdon apostatized from Smith's church. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that along the way, slowly but surely, Joseph Smith apostatized from Rigdon's better church, and he brought things into Rigdon's church that would eventually ruin and completely undo the Mormon church. Rigdon was very opposed to polygamy. He was ironically the one doctrine from the Old Testament that he believed should never be restored. And so Smith trying to argue that it should be, he didn't win that fight for a long time. And so one of the reasons why he was so clandestine with it is because he couldn't stand the pushback from Sidney Rigdon. But he wanted that because he was into it, and he felt that a restoration of polygamy was warranted, and he used it as an excuse to do unspeakable things. But it was definitely Joseph Smith that apostatized from Rigdon's more pious church, not the other way around.
Well, I tell you what, I think we're going to leave it there. I know we saw Shane's second question up there on the screen. We'll have to leave that for another time. Sorry, Shane. At least you got number 1 in. Thank you for that. And thank you, Lars, for being with us and sharing your theory. I think it's fascinating. I would encourage everybody to go ahead and get this book. This is it's a phenomenal work. There's a great deal of work in this book. It's a wonderful read. He's a good writer. Whether you come away from it convinced or not, I still think it's worth reading. And there's a great deal of resource material in this. A number of things that I learned reading it that I hadn't known before. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Lars. And Bill Reel, thank you for being on the show too.
Hey,
it's always nice to
you're
see you,
welcome,
my
RFM.
friend.
Yeah. Awesome. Glad to be here.
Okay, I thought you were doing like a ventriloquist thing where you're
No.
talking without moving your lips.
No.
Okay, maybe
Am I
it's just me.
frozen?
You were just for a second, but it's okay.
Sorry about that.
So thanks, everybody. And please join us next week on Mormonism Live. Next Wednesday, same bat time, same bat channel. And what are you saying, Bill? What are you doing? What are you doing?
I was doing the
there?
ventriloquist thing. I was just playing along.
Okay. Well, you're monkeying with my closing, so knock it off. Okay. I'm going to do it again. Take two. Please join us next week. Same bat time, same bat channel for Mormonism Live. Good night, everybody. Well, here we are again.